3 heartbeats flickered on the ultrasound screen, where Vivian Carter expected to see only one small problem she couldn't afford to keep. Before the nurse could explain that she was carrying triplets, gunfire erupted in the clinic hallway. Armed men were hunting her, a woman whose biggest crime had been a one-night mistake at a stranger's wedding. Within the hour, she'd stand before Adrian Blackwood, the East Coast's most feared crime boss, and learn that the babies growing inside her were worth more than empires. Her simple life was over. His deadly world had just begun. The fluorescent lights in the clinic waiting room hummed with kind of sterile indifference that matched Vivian Carter's mood perfectly. She sat with her purse clutched against her stomach, fingers worrying the frayed strap, trying not to meet anyone's eyes. The other women in the waiting area looked just as lost, just as alone. At 27, Vivian had imagined her life would look different. A stable job, a loving partner, maybe a small apartment that didn't smell like mildew and broken dreams. Instead, she was drowning in $30,000 of medical debt from her mother's final hospital stay, working double shifts at a diner that paid minimum wage, and now this, pregnant. The words still felt foreign in her mouth, like a language she'd never learned to speak. It had been one night, one stupid, reckless night, 6 weeks ago at her coworker's wedding reception. Too much champagne, too much loneliness, and a stranger with dark eyes who'd made her feel seen for the first time in years. She didn't even know his full name, just Adrian. He disappeared before dawn, leaving her with nothing but a memory that burned hotter than it should have, and consequences she couldn't afford to keep. The nurse's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, calling for Vivian Carter. Vivian stood on shaking legs and followed the woman down a narrow hallway into an examination room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. The paper on the examination table crinkled loudly as she climbed onto it. The nurse, her voice professionally neutral, said they'd do the ultrasound first, just to confirm dates and make sure everything was progressing normally before they discussed her options. Options. What a polite word for the decision tearing Vivian apart from the inside. She lay back and lifted her shirt, flinching at the cold gel spread across her abdomen. The ultrasound technician, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, positioned the wand and began moving it slowly across Vivian's skin. The room filled with the sound of static, then something else, a rapid thumping that made Vivian's chest tighten. The technician spoke slowly, her brow furrowing as she adjusted the screen. She was just going to hold on a moment. Vivian's heart began to race. She asked what was wrong. The technician didn't answer. Immediately, her focus locked on the grainy black and white image. She moved the wand to a different position, then another, her expression shifting from confusion to something Vivian couldn't quite read. She finally said that nothing was wrong, but her voice carried a weight that contradicted the words. She told Vivian she needed her to look at the screen. She asked if she saw these 3 distinct sacs. Vivian stared at the monitor, trying to make sense of the abstract shapes. She didn't understand. The technician told her she was carrying triplets. The world tilted sideways. Vivian's mouth went dry, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint focused on those 3 separate shadows on the screen. 3 heartbeats, 3 lives, 3 impossible futures she had no way to provide for. Her voice cracked as she said that's not possible. She asked if the technician was sure. The technician's hand was gentle on Vivian's shoulder as she confirmed she was certain. She knew this was a shock and told her to take a moment to breathe, but Vivian couldn't breathe. Her lungs felt paralyzed, her mind racing through catastrophic calculations. 1 baby had seemed impossible. 3 was beyond comprehension. The medical bills alone would bury her. The time off work, the supplies, 3 of everything. She was already barely surviving. How could she possibly? The explosion of sound shattered her panic. Gunfire, unmistakable and terrifyingly close. Screams erupted from the waiting room, followed by the crash of furniture and harsh male voices shouting, commands Vivian couldn't make out over the blood rushing in her ears. The technician's face went white. She hissed for Vivian to stay there, but she was already moving toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She never made it. The door slammed open, and a man in a dark suit filled the doorframe. He wasn't young, but he moved with predatory efficiency, his hand inside his jacket where Vivian could see the outline of a weapon. His eyes swept the room and locked onto her with unsettling precision. He said her name, Vivian Carter. Terror flooded through her veins like ice water. She didn't know who he was. He told her she needed to come with him now. The technician stepped between them, her voice shaking but firm. She told the man he couldn't be in here and that she was calling security. The man's hand emerged from his jacket, not with a gun, but with a phone. He held it up, showing the screen to the technician. Whatever she saw there drained the color from her face completely. She stepped aside without another word. Vivian's survival instincts finally kicked in. She rolled off the examination table, her hand still clutching her shirt down, and stumbled backward toward the room's second door. An emergency exit she'd noticed when she first entered. The man's voice was almost gentle as he told her not to run. He said that Mr. Blackwood just wanted to talk to her and that no one needed to get hurt, but Vivian was already moving. She yanked open the emergency exit and plunged into a stairwell, the alarm shrieking behind her. Her shoes slapped against concrete as she took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her, she heard the door crash open again and heavy footsteps pursuing. She hit the ground floor at full speed and burst through another door into a parking garage. The afternoon sun was too bright, disorienting after the artificial light inside. Vivian ran without thinking, without planning, just pure animal panic driving her forward between rows of parked cars. A black SUV screeched around the corner ahead of her, cutting off her escape. Vivian pivoted and ran the other direction, but 2 more men appeared from behind a concrete pillar. They moved like soldiers, coordinated and calm, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. She tried to scream, but one of them was faster. A hand clamped over her mouth. Another arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. Vivian thrashed and kicked, but it was useless. The man was twice her size, and within seconds, she was being carried toward the waiting SUV. One of them said sharply to be careful. He said that Mr. Blackwood told them not to hurt her. They placed her in the back seat with surprising gentleness, one man sliding in on either side of her, while a third took the driver's seat. The doors locked with a heavy click that sounded like a prison cell closing. Vivian's breath came in ragged gasps, her mind screaming at her to do something, anything. But there was nowhere to go and no way to fight. The SUV pulled smoothly out of the parking garage and merged into traffic as if nothing unusual had just happened. Vivian finally managed to ask where they were taking her, her voice barely above a whisper. The man to her left, the one who'd first found her in the examination room, glanced at her with something that might have been sympathy. He said they were going somewhere safe. Vivian's laugh bordered on hysterical as she questioned the idea of safety after being kidnapped at gunpoint. The man remained maddeningly calm, stating that no guns were drawn and she wasn't being kidnapped. He claimed she was being protected. Protected from what? He didn't answer, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than any threat could have been. The drive lasted 45 minutes, taking them out of the city and into countryside Vivian had never seen before. Massive estates began appearing behind iron gates and stone walls, each one more imposing than the last. Finally, the SUV turned onto a private road that wound through manicured grounds, so vast Vivian couldn't see where they ended. The mansion that eventually appeared before them didn't look real. It was something from a movie. All modern glass and ancient stone somehow merged into an architectural statement of impossible wealth. Fountains flanked the circular driveway. Sculptures that probably cost more than Vivian would earn in her lifetime dotted the perfectly maintained lawns. The SUV stopped at the main entrance and the men escorted her out. Not roughly, but with an efficiency that made it clear resistance would be pointless. They guided her up marble steps, through massive wooden doors, and into an entrance hall that made Vivian feel smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. One of the men told her to wait there, gesturing to a sitting area furnished with antiques that belonged in a museum. Then they left her alone. Vivian stood frozen, her mind unable to process the surreal shift from the clinic's sterile walls to this overwhelming display of wealth. Her hand unconsciously moved to her stomach where 3 impossible lives continued growing, unaware of the chaos their existence had triggered. The sound of footsteps on marble made her turn. The man walking toward her stole the breath from her lungs. She recognized him immediately, though she'd only seen him once before in dim lighting at a wedding reception 6 weeks ago. Adrian Blackwood looked different in the afternoon sun, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked more dangerous, more real, more absolutely terrifying in his casual control of everything around him. He was tall, perhaps 6'3", with dark hair styled with careless fuss perfection and eyes the color of smoke before a storm. The suit he wore probably cost more than her yearly rent, fitted to emphasize a frame that suggested hours in a private gym, but it was his face that held her attention. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, and an expression of such controlled intensity that Vivian felt pinned in place by his gaze alone. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before, possessive, certain, weighted with meanings she didn't understand. She breathed his name, then anger flooded through her fear. She accused him of having her kidnapped and sending armed men to a medical clinic. Adrian interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that probably silenced boardrooms and terrified enemies. He said he sent men to protect her, that there's a difference. Vivian demanded to know what he was protecting her from, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She insisted she was fine until his thugs showed up. He told her she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The words hit her like a physical blow. She shot back that it wasn't his decision to make. Something flickered across Adrian's face, an emotion too quick to identify before his expression returned to that unreadable mask of control. He moved closer, close enough that Vivian caught the scent of expensive cologne, and something darker underneath, something that made her pulse race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. He said quietly that the children she was carrying were his, each word precisely chosen. That, he stated, made it very much his decision. Vivian took a step backward, her back hitting the wall. She asked how he even knew. She hadn't known his last name and had no way to contact him. The casual admission that he'd been having her watched since the night they met sent ice down her spine. She accused him of stalking her. Adrian corrected her, saying he was protecting her. He asked if she had any idea who he was or what he did. She shook her head mutely, though pieces were starting to fall into terrible place. The armed men, the mansion, the way everyone seemed to fear his name. Adrian's smile held no warmth. He explained that he controlled most of the criminal enterprises on the East Coast, including shipping, importing, money laundering, and protection services. Some people called him a businessman, others used less polite terms. What mattered, he said, was that he had enemies who would love nothing more than to discover he had a weakness. He asked if she thought carrying 3 children with his blood in their veins made her a weakness. His voice dropped to something almost gentle. He told her that it made her the most valuable target in his world and the most protected. Vivian's mind reeled. This couldn't be real. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a nobody waitress drowning in debt. Now she was standing in a crime lord's mansion, being told she was carrying his heirs. She said she wanted to leave, hating how her voice shook. She wanted to go home right now. He replied with a single absolute word, no. Vivian insisted he couldn't keep her here, though the tremor in her voice undermined her conviction. She called it kidnapping. Adrian, matter-of-factly, stated that the law didn't apply to men like him. He told her that her old lit life was over. The moment she walked into that clinic planning to terminate his children, she became part of his world. And in his world, those babies represented the future of an empire worth billions. He declared that they would be born healthy and safe, raised with every advantage, and protected from every threat. That was not negotiable. Vivian said desperately that they weren't his to claim, that he had no right. Adrian moved so fast she didn't have time to flinch. His hand cupped her face with surprising gentleness, tilting her chin up until she had no choice but to meet his eyes. The intensity there stole her breath. It wasn't cruelty, but something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. He said softly that he had every right, and that she would understand that soon enough. He told her the mansion had 50 rooms, and she could choose anyone she liked. She'd have staff to attend to her every need, doctors who specialized in high-risk pregnancies, and security that would keep her safer than she'd ever been in her life. In return, all he asked was that she carry those children to term and allow them to be raised as they deserved. She asked what would happen if she refused. Adrian's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, the gesture almost tender. He said she wouldn't, because despite her fear and anger, he saw something in her that night they met. He called her a survivor. She did what needed to be done to stay alive, and right now, staying alive meant accepting his protection. He released her and stepped back, pulling a phone from his pocket. He said Elena would show her to her room and to tell her anything she needed. He warned her that if she tried to leave the grounds, his men would stop her. Not violently, he meant what he said about keeping her safe, but she would not leave until those children were born. He asked if she understood. Vivian wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything but accept this nightmare. But looking at Adrian Blackwood's implacable expression, she understood with crushing certainty that she had no power here, no choices, no escape. She whispered that she understood. Adrian said good. He turned to leave, then paused. He said that for what it was worth, he was sorry it had to be this way. In another life, perhaps things could have been different between them. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing away down the marble hall, leaving Vivian alone with her terror and the 3 tiny heartbeats that had just condemned her to a beautiful prison. A woman appeared moments later, younger than Vivian had expected, with long dark hair and Adrian's same striking features softened into something approaching warmth. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Elena, Adrian's sister, and extended a hand. She acknowledged that this must be overwhelming, but promised they weren't monsters. She then offered to show Vivian where she'd be staying. Vivian followed numbly, her mind still trying to process everything that had happened in the last 2 hours. Elena kept up a steady stream of pleasant conversation. As they climbed a grand staircase and walked down a hallway lined with priceless artwork, Elena said that Adrian could be intense, glancing back with what seemed like genuine sympathy. But she insisted he wasn't cruel. He just valued family above everything else. She assured Vivian she'd see. The room Elena showed her to was larger than Vivian's entire apartment had been. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, surrounded by elegant furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate grounds. A door led to a private bathroom with a tub big enough to swim in. Elena gestured, saying there was a closet through there. She said they'd have clothes brought in her size. If Vivian needed anything like books, movies, or special food, she just had to ask. She had full access to the grounds, the library, and the pool. The only rule was she couldn't leave. Vivian sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs finally giving out. She asked how long until the babies were born. Elena said gently, 6 months, maybe 7. She knew it seemed impossible now, but said Vivian might find it wasn't as terrible as she thought. Adrian's world had its advantages. After Elena left, Vivian sat in silence for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. She thought about the clinic, about the decision she'd been about to make, about the 3 lives growing inside her that had transformed from a problem she couldn't solve into the most valuable commodities in a crime lord's empire. She thought about her old apartment with its leaking ceiling and broken heat, about the diner where she pulled double shifts for tips that barely covered her bills, about the mountain of debt that crushed her every time she tried to imagine a future. And she thought about Adrian Blackwood's eyes when he touched her face, the gentleness in a man who commanded armies of criminals, the way her traitorous body had responded to his proximity despite everything her mind was screaming. Night fell across the estate, painting the grounds in shades of purple and gold. Vivian watched from her window as security lights flickered on, revealing the true scope of her cage. Beautiful, luxurious, and absolutely inescapable. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling nothing yet but knowing that 3 tiny hearts were beating beneath her palm. She whispered to them that she was sorry. She didn't know how to protect them from this. She didn't even know how to protect herself. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, a small, stubborn part of Vivian's mind began working. Adrian had called her a survivor, and he was right. She'd survived her mother's death, the crushing debt, the loneliness that had driven her into a stranger's arms for one reckless night. She would survive this too. And maybe, just maybe, she'd find a way to escape before her children became prisoners of their father's empire. The thought sustained her as she finally lay down in the too soft bed, exhaustion pulling her towards sleep. Tomorrow she would start planning. Tomorrow she would figure out how to reclaim her freedom. But tonight, in the darkness of a mansion that felt like both a palace and a prison, Vivian Carter closed her eyes and wondered if the man who'd stolen her life away might be the only one who could keep her alive. The first week passed in a strange blur of luxury and captivity that left Vivian feeling increasingly unmoored from reality. She woke each morning in the enormous bed to find breakfast already waiting on a silver tray. Fresh fruit, pastries still warm from the oven, coffee that smelled better than anything she'd ever made in her cramped apartment. A rotation of staff appeared throughout the day, always polite, always efficient, treating her like an honored guest rather than a prisoner. But the doors were still locked from the outside at night. The security cameras still tracked her movements through the hallways, and Adrian Blackwood remained a distant presence she caught glimpses of but never spoke to directly. She saw him sometimes through windows, crossing the grounds with men in dark suits, following at a respectful distance. Once she spotted him in what appeared to be a home office, standing before floor-to-ceiling screens filled with numbers and data she couldn't decipher. He moved through his world with the absolute confidence of a man who'd never been told no, who'd never encountered a problem his money or power couldn't solve. Vivian spent her days exploring the mansion, testing the boundaries of her cage. The library became her favorite refuge. 3 stories of books lining mahogany shelves with rolling ladders and reading nooks tucked into corners. She found first editions worth more than her mother's medical bills, poetry collections in languages she didn't speak, and an entire section devoted to pregnancy and child-rearing that made her stomach twist. Elena visited often, always friendly, always offering companionship that Vivian desperately wanted to trust, but couldn't quite bring herself to accept. There was something in Adrian's sister that didn't match her warm smiles. A calculation behind her eyes that set Vivian's instincts on edge. One afternoon, Elena found Vivian in the library with a book on high-risk pregnancies open in her lap. She said Vivian was looking healthier already, that the color was back in her face. Vivian closed the book carefully and replied that 3 meals a day will do that. Elena settled into the chair across from her, crossing her legs with elegant ease. She said Vivian was struggling before. It wasn't a question. She mentioned that Adrian had shown her the reports about her apartment, the diner, the debt. She said Vivian was drowning. Vivian stated that those reports were an invasion of her privacy. Elena agreed that it probably was, without shame. But she explained that her brother is thorough about things he cares about, and right now he cares very much about keeping Vivian and those babies safe. Vivian corrected her sharply, saying he cares about his heirs, that she's just the incubator. Something flickered across Elena's face. Approval, maybe, or respect. She said Vivian was smarter than Adrian expected, and that it was good. She'd need to be smart to survive in this world. The word sent a chill down Vivian's spine. She asked what Elena meant by survive. But Elena just smiled and changed the subject, asking about the books Vivian had been reading, steering the conversation into safer waters. Yet the warning lingered in the air between them like smoke. That night, Vivian couldn't sleep. She paced her room, restless and aching with the need to do something, anything, to reclaim some measure of control over her life. Around midnight, she finally gave up and slipped out into the hallway, padding barefoot across plush carpet toward the staircase. The mansion felt different at night. The daytime staff had vanished, leaving only the quiet presence of security she knew was there, but couldn't see. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Vivian made her way down to the kitchen, thinking maybe warm milk would help her sleep, the way her mother used to make it when Vivian was small. She was reaching for a saucepan when a voice from the doorway froze her in place. Adrian asked if she was having trouble sleeping. He stood silhouetted against the hallway light, still dressed in suit pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal surprisingly strong forearms. He looked tired, she realized, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying a weight no one else could see. Vivian said she didn't think he'd be awake, hating how her voice came out breathless. Adrian moved into the kitchen with that same predatory grace she'd noticed before. He said he didn't sleep much. Every movement was economical and controlled. The Empire doesn't rest, so neither can he. She commented that it must be exhausting, running a criminal organization. His lips quirked in something that might have been amusement. He said she'd be surprised how similar it is to running any other business. Supply chains, employee management, hostile takeovers. The main difference is how they handle competition. Vivian said flatly that they kill them. Adrian pulled down 2 mugs from a cabinet, moving around the kitchen with the ease of someone who actually knew where things were. He said more often they negotiate. Death is expensive and draws attention. He preferred solutions that benefit everyone. She called him magnanimous. He noted that she was angry. He poured milk into both mugs and set them in the microwave. He said that was good, that anger is easier than fear. Vivian leaned against the counter, crossing her arms over her chest. She pointed out that he kidnapped her, locked her in a mansion, and told her she couldn't leave until she birthed his children. She asked what exactly she should be feeling. Adrian said she should be grateful, and the word hung between them like a challenge. He said her old life was killing her slowly. Here, she had everything she needed except freedom. He argued that freedom is overrated when you're starving. The microwave beeped, and Adrian retrieved the mugs, handing one to Vivian. He said he'd looked into her finances. In 6 months, she would have been evicted. The debt collectors were circling. Without those babies, she had nothing. The casual cruelty of his words stole her breath. She told him he didn't know anything about her life. He corrected her quietly, saying he knew everything about her life. He knew her mother died of ovarian cancer 18 months ago. He knew the hospital bills destroyed her credit. He knew she'd been working 70-hour weeks, trying to stay afloat and failing. He knew she went to bed hungry most nights because she couldn't afford both rent and food. He asked if he should continue. Vivian's hand shook, milk sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her mug. She told him to stop. Adrian said the truth hurts, but his voice had gentled slightly. He said it was still the truth. He told Vivienne she was drowning, and that he was offering her a life raft with strings attached. He countered that everything worthwhile has strings attached. They stood in silence for a moment. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of an antique clock somewhere in the mansion's depths. Vivian studied Adrian's face in the dim light, searching for some hint of the man who'd made her laugh at that wedding reception, who'd touched her like she was precious, who'd made her feel seen for the first time in years. She finally asked why he chose her. That night at the wedding, he could have had anyone. Something shifted in Adrian's expression, a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. He explained that she was sitting alone at a table in the corner, watching everyone else dance. She looked sad and beautiful and completely out of place. He recognized that feeling. She pointed out that he was a billionaire crime lord and couldn't possibly understand loneliness. Adrian said softly that power is the loneliest thing in the world. Everyone wants something from you. Everyone fears you. No one sees you. But that night she'd looked at him like he was just a man. He hadn't felt that in years. The vulnerability in his admission caught Vivian completely off guard. For a moment, she glimpsed the human being beneath the ruthless reputation. Someone just as trapped as she was, just in a different kind of cage. She said that didn't make what he was doing right. Adrian agreed that it didn't, but it made it necessary. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully about the children. He shared that his mother abandoned him when he was 8 years old, leaving him with a father who saw him as a weapon to be sharpened, not a child to be loved. He'd built this empire from nothing, and he did it alone. The babies she was carrying were the first family he'd chosen in 30 years. He would not lose them. The raw honesty in his voice made Vivian's chest ache. She set down her mug with trembling hands. She asked about herself, if she factored into this family he was building, or if she was just the delivery system. Adrian stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He admitted he hadn't decided yet. She replied, how comforting. He asked if she wanted comfort, saying he'd provide it. If she wanted honesty, he raised his hand, hesitating a moment before brushing a strand of hair back from her face. Honestly, he didn't know what to do with her. Vivian Carter. You complicate things. She replied that maybe she didn't want to be uncomplicated, that maybe she was counting on that. The air between them felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Vivian's pulse hammered in her throat as Adrian's fingers lingered against her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with devastating gentleness. She should pull away, should remember that this man had stolen her freedom, that everything beautiful around her was just a prettier prison. But her body remembered the wedding night, too, the way he'd made her feel alive and wanted and free in a way she'd never experienced before or since. She whispered that this was insane. Adrian agreed it probably was, but he didn't move away. The moment shattered when footsteps echoed in the hallway. Adrian stepped back smoothly as Elena appeared in the doorway, her expression sharp despite the late hour. She told Adrian they had a problem. Dmitri had called. The shipment from Rotterdam was intercepted. Adrian's entire demeanor shifted instantly from the almost tender man to the crime lord who commanded empires. He asked when. Elena said 2 hours ago. Port Authority found the containers before their people could move them. He asked how much they lost. 15 million street value. Plus, the buyers were demanding refunds. Adrian's jaw tightened. He said he'd handle it and needed 20 minutes. Elena's gaze flickered to Vivian with something Vivian couldn't quite read, then back to her brother. She said they should go to the conference room. Adrian confirmed. He turned back to Vivian, and for just a second, she saw regret in his eyes. He told her to get some sleep and that they'd continue this conversation another time. Then he was gone, Elena following, leaving Vivian alone in the kitchen with 2 mugs of cooling milk and the lingering warmth where Adrian's fingers had touched her skin. The following days brought a shift in the mansion's atmosphere. Adrian disappeared for long stretches, returning late at night with tension written in every line of his body. The staff moved with increased urgency. More security appeared on the grounds, and Elena's visits became more frequent, more probing, asking casual questions about Vivian's health, her comfort level, her relationship with Adrian. One afternoon, Elena found Vivian by the pool with a book she wasn't really reading. She commented that he seemed distracted and that the business problems were piling up. Vivian said she wouldn't know, that she barely saw him. Elena replied that was probably for the best. She stretched out on the lounge chair beside her, perfect in a designer swimsuit that probably cost more than Vivian's car. She added that her brother's world was dangerous right now, and it was better to keep her distance. But Vivian found she didn't want distance. Despite everything, despite the kidnapping, the control, the impossible situation, she caught herself listening for Adrian's footsteps in the halls, looking for glimpses of him through windows, replaying their midnight kitchen conversation in her mind until every word was memorized. It was stupid, dangerous, exactly the kind of emotional vulnerability that could destroy her, and yet she couldn't seem to stop. The breaking point came 2 weeks into her captivity. Vivian was in the library when she heard raised voices from somewhere deeper in the mansion. Curiosity overcame caution, and she followed the sound down a hallway she hadn't explored before, toward a door that stood slightly ajar. Elena's voice drifted through, sharp with anger. She was saying he was getting too attached, that Vivian was a liability. She thought they should have just paid her off and taken the babies when they were born. Adrian's voice was cold and commanding, stating that was never the plan. She would stay here where he could protect her. Elena questioned if he was protecting her or controlling her, because from where she was standing, he was letting sentiment cloud his judgment. He insisted his judgment was fine. Elena pushed back, asking if it was, because Dmitri said he turned down the Montenegro deal, because it would require him to be out of the country for 3 weeks. He'd never let anything interfere with business before. Silence fell, thick and dangerous. Vivian held her breath, pressed against the wall just out of sight. When Adrian finally spoke, his voice was low and lethal. He told Elena that what he did with his time was not her concern. She retorted that everything he did was her concern when it affected this family. She called Vivian nothing, a nobody from nowhere who got lucky one night, and warned him not to mistake her for something she's not. He asked what she thought Vivian was. A womb. Elena said that's all she'll ever be to him, no matter what lies he told himself late when he checked on her like some lovesick teenager. The single word, enough, cracked like a whip. Vivian flinched, her heart racing. Adrian continued, each word precisely measured. He told his sister she was forgetting herself. Vivian was under his protection, and that made her untouchable. If he heard her speak about her that way again, there would be consequences. He asked if she understood. Elena's voice dripped with false sweetness. She understood perfectly and would leave him to his delusions. Footsteps approached the door. Vivian barely had time to retreat around the corner before Elena emerged, her expression thunderous. She stalked past without noticing Vivian pressed into a shadowy alcove, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble. Vivian waited until the footsteps faded before releasing her held breath. Her mind reeled from what she'd overheard. Elena's barely concealed contempt, Adrian's unexpected defense. The revelation that he checked on her at night when she was sleeping. She should feel violated by that last part. Instead, warmth spread through her chest. Adrian's voice from inside the room made Vivian jump. He told her she could come out now. He'd known she was there. Of course, he had. Men like Adrian Blackwood didn't survive by being unobservant. Vivian stepped into the doorway. Adrian stood by the window, his back to her, hands in his pockets. Even from behind, she could read the tension in his shoulders. He asked how much she heard without turning. Enough. He then said she knew his sister thought he was making a mistake keeping her here. Vivian asked if he was. Adrian turned, and the expression on his face stole Vivian's breath. It wasn't the cold mask of the crime lord, or the controlled calculation of the businessman. It was something raw and real and frighteningly vulnerable. He admitted he didn't know, but he couldn't seem to make himself have care about the strategic implications, not when it came to her. Vivian's throat tightened. She asked why. Adrian said simply it was because she looked at him like he was human. Everyone else saw the empire, the power, the reputation. They saw what he could give them or what he could take away. But she saw him, and that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. The honesty in his words cracked something open in Vivian's chest. She crossed the room before she could talk herself out of it, closing the distance between them until only a foot of charged air separated them. She said she was still angry at him for taking her choices away, for treating her like property. He knew. She added that she didn't trust him, not completely. He didn't expect her to. But she also didn't think he was a monster. Vivian placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating hard beneath her palm. She thought he was a man who'd spent so long protecting himself that he's forgotten how to let anyone in. Adrian's hand covered hers, pressing it more firmly against his chest. He said that letting people in gets you killed in his world. She replied that maybe it did, or maybe it was what made him human enough to survive it. For a long moment, they stood there, connected by touch and truth, and something neither of them could name. Then Adrian lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with devastating tenderness. He murmured against her skin that she was dangerous. She whispered back that it was good, that maybe he needed someone dangerous in his life. The kiss happened inevitably, like gravity pulling them together. Adrian's mouth on hers was nothing like their first kiss at the wedding. That had been champagne and recklessness and escape. This was hunger and recognition and the terrifying acknowledgement of something real between them. Vivian melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, anchoring herself against the dizzying intensity of his touch. Adrian kissed her like she was air, and he was drowning, like she was the answer to questions he'd been asking all his life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. He said roughly that this didn't change anything. She was still staying here, still under his protection. She knew. He added that he was still a criminal who'd done terrible things to build this empire. She knew that too. She asked why then. Vivian interrupted, saying it was because she was tired of being afraid. And because maybe they were both trapped in cages of their own making, and maybe they could figure out how to be free together. Adrian pulled back slightly, searching her face. He said she didn't know what she was saying, mentioning the danger, the enemies, the life he leads. Vivian said steadily that she knew she was carrying 3 babies who would be born into this world, whether she wanted them to be or not. She knew running would get her killed. And she knew that despite everything, when he touched her, she felt safer than she had in years. That might make her crazy, but it was the truth. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. A decision being made, a door being opened that had been locked for decades. He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with infinite care. He said quietly that if they did this, if they tried to build something real between them, it wouldn't be easy. His world would test her in ways she couldn't imagine. She insisted she was stronger than she looked. He replied that he was beginning to understand that. Adrian kissed her again, softer this time, sweet and full of promise. He asked her to stay with him, not because she was trapped, but because she chose to. The explosion of sound cut off her words. Glass shattered somewhere in the mansion, followed by shouts and the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Adrian's entire body went rigid, his expression transforming instantly into lethal focus. He commanded her to stay here, already moving toward the door. He told her to lock it behind him and not to open it for anyone but him. She asked what was happening, but he was already gone, leaving Vivian alone as chaos erupted through the mansion like a storm. More gunfire, running footsteps, screams that made her blood run cold. Vivian's hands moved to her stomach, protective instinct overwhelming everything else. She stumbled toward the door, meaning to lock it as Adrian had ordered, when Elena appeared in the hallway. Elena grabbed her arm, pulling hard. She said they had to get her out of here. The Vulaf had found out about her and were attacking the house. Vivian said that Adrian told her to lock the door. Elena replied that Adrian was handling the security breach downstairs and that she was supposed to get Vivian to the safe room. Something in Vivian's gut screamed a warning, but the sounds of violence were getting closer, and Elena was already dragging her down the hallway at a run. They burst through a service entrance Vivian had never seen before, into a narrow stairwell that led down into darkness. Vivian gasped, trying to keep up and asking where they were going. Elena explained it was a tunnel system under the estate that led to the garages. They'd get her out before. Elena's words cut off as they emerged into an underground garage lit by harsh fluorescent lights. But instead of cars waiting to spirit them away to safety, Vivian saw 3 men in dark tactical gear standing beside a black van. Her blood turned to ice. Elena's grip on her arm tightened painfully. When Vivian turned to look at her, Adrian's sister was smiling, a cold, triumphant expression that transformed her beautiful face into something cruel. Elena said she was sorry, though she didn't sound sorry at all. She explained that those babies were worth far more to her brother's enemies than they were to him, and she always did prefer the highest bidder. Vivian tried to scream, tried to fight, but one of the men was already moving forward with a cloth in his hand. The chemical smell hit her nose a second before darkness swallowed her whole. Vivian woke to the smell of rust and decay, her head pounding with a chemical fog that made thinking feel like swimming through mud. The surface beneath her was cold concrete, rough against her cheek. She tried to move and discovered her wrists were bound behind her back with zip ties that cut into her skin. Panic flooded through her system, burning away the last traces of whatever Elena had used to knock her unconscious. Vivian forced her eyes open and immediately wished she hadn't. She was in some kind of warehouse, massive and empty, except for industrial debris scattered across the floor. Broken pallets, rusted machinery, water damage staining the walls in abstract patterns that looked like old blood. High windows let in weak daylight that suggested hours had passed since the attack on the mansion. 3 men stood near the entrance, speaking in low voices. Not Elena's tactical team from the garage. These were different men, harder looking, with the casual violence of people who hurt others for a living. One of them noticed Vivian stirring and said something that made the others turn. He said she was awake and to go tell Konstantin. Vivian's stomach dropped. She knew that name, had heard Adrian mention it once in a phone call she'd accidentally overheard. Konstantin Vulaf, head of the Russian crime family that had been trying to move into Adrian's territory for years. The kind of man who made Adrian Blackwood look merciful by comparison. Footsteps approached from deeper in the warehouse. A man emerged from the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and eyes like chips of Arctic ice. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered. His accent transformed her name into something foreign and threatening. He said, Miss Carter was finally awake, and that they had much to discuss. Vivian struggled to sit up, her bound hands making the movement awkward and painful. She asked where she was. He replied that she was somewhere Adrian Blackwood would never find her, or at least not before they accomplished what they needed to. Her voice came out as a whisper as she realized they wanted the babies. Her free hand instinctively moved to protect her stomach. Konstantin smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said she was very perceptive. Adrian's heirs were worth a great deal to certain parties. Some wanted them dead, eliminating the next generation of Blackwoods before they could be born. Others wanted them alive as leverage. He preferred the latter option, as it was less messy and more profitable. She retorted that Adrian would kill him for this. Konstantin corrected her, saying Adrian would try, but first he had to find her. And thanks to his traitorous sister providing such detailed information about his security protocols, he was confident they had several days before his people even knew where to begin looking. The casual mention of Elena's betrayal made Vivian's chest tight with fury and fear in equal measure. She asked why she would do this, since Adrian was her brother. Constantine stood, looking down at her with something almost like pity. He said family meant different things to different people. Elena had ambitions her brother didn't take seriously. She believed a woman could never truly lead the Blackwood Empire while Adrian lived. This arrangement served both their interests beautifully. He was going to help her kill him eventually. First, they would extract maximum value from this situation. He explained that she and those babies represented $30 million in ransom, payable not by Adrian, but by his enemies who wanted him weakened enough to destroy. Once they had the money, they'd deliver her to them, and they'd use her to break the great Adrian Blackwood. When he was sufficiently devastated, Lane would arrange for his tragic death, inherit the empire, and reward him with control of the eastern shipping routes. Everyone would win, except her, Vivian said through gritted teeth. Constantine agreed without shame. He said she was always just a pawn in much larger games, and the sooner she accepted this, the easier the next few months would be. He turned to leave, and desperation made Vivian call out. She pleaded for a doctor for the babies, arguing that if something happened to them, he'd lose his leverage. Constantine paused, considering. He said she made a valid point, and he would send someone to examine her. But he warned her not to mistake pragmatism for mercy. He would keep her alive only as long as she was useful. If she tried to escape, refused to cooperate, or caused trouble in any way, he would demonstrate exactly how little her life meant to him. He asked if she understood. Vivian nodded mutely, hating herself for the submission, but knowing she had no other choice. Constantine left, taking 2 of the guards with him. The third remained by the door, armed and alert, making it clear that any attempted escape would be futile. Alone, except for her silent guard, Vivian finally let the tears come. They burned hot down her cheeks, as the full horror of her situation crashed over her like a wave. She'd been kidnapped, betrayed, and sold to Adrian's worst enemy. The man she'd been starting to trust, maybe even starting to feel something deeper for, would think she'd escaped or been killed. And the 3 lives growing inside her were now bargaining chips in a war she didn't understand. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, something she'd said during those final weeks in the hospital. She'd told her baby girl that she was stronger than she knew. When the world tries to break you, you bend instead. You survive. Vivian pressed her forehead against the cold concrete and forced herself to breathe. She was still alive. The babies were still alive, and somewhere out there, Adrian Blackwood was looking for her. She had to believe that. He'd defended her to Elena. He'd kissed her like she mattered. He wouldn't just abandon her to his enemies. She hoped. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. The doctor arrived eventually, a nervous man who examined her with shaking hands while a guard watched. He confirmed the baby's heartbeats were strong, gave her prenatal vitamins, and left without meeting her eyes. Vivian wondered how much Constantine was paying him to violate every oath he'd ever taken. They moved her to a small room deeper in the warehouse. As night fell, cutting the zip ties and replacing them with a chain attached to a radiator that gave her enough movement to reach a bucket in the corner and a thin mattress on the floor. Someone brought food that Vivian forced herself to eat despite her churning stomach. She needed strength, needed to stay sharp, needed to survive. The attack came at 3 a.m. Vivian woke to the sound of gunfire, closer and louder than anything she'd heard at the mansion. Her guard rushed to the door, weapon drawn, shouting into a radio. More shots, then screams, then an explosion that shook the entire building and rained dust down from the ceiling. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. The guard spun toward the threat, but he never got a shot off. 2 men in black tactical gear appeared like shadows made solid, moving with lethal efficiency. One shot caught the guard in the chest, dropping him instantly. The second man was already crossing the room toward Vivian. She scrambled backward, terror overriding everything else, until she saw the emblem on his tactical vest, a stylized bee that she recognized from paperwork she'd seen scattered around Adrian's office. He told Miss Carter they were here to extract her. He instructed her not to fight, not to run, and to stay close to him. He asked if she understood. Vivian nodded frantically. The man produced bolt cutters and freed her from the chain in seconds, then handed her off to his partner while he secured the hallway. More gunfire echoed through the warehouse, controlled bursts that spoke of professional soldiers rather than panicked shooting. They moved through the building at a run, Vivian's rescuers forming a protective shell around her. Bodies littered the floor, some wearing tactical gear like Constantine's men, others in the black uniforms of Adrian's security forces. The warehouse had become a battlefield. They emerged into the loading bay, where SUVs idled with engines running and doors open. Vivian was pushed into the back seat of the nearest vehicle, bracketed by armed men on either side. The door had barely closed before the driver floored the accelerator, tires screaming as they shot out into the night. A familiar voice crackled through the radio. It was Adrian's voice, tight with an emotion Vivian couldn't name, asking if she was hurt. The man replied, "Negative, sir. Minor injuries only. 3 heartbeats confirmed on the ultrasound scan earlier." The package was secure. The relief in Adrian's responding exhale was audible, even through the radio static. He told them to bring her home and that he'd meet them there. The drive passed in a blur of adrenaline and shock. Vivian stared out the window at the passing streets, her mind unable to fully process everything that had happened. The betrayal, the warehouse, the rescue that had come with military precision. By the time they pulled through the gates of Adrian's estate, false dawn was painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. Adrian was waiting on the front steps when they arrived, looking like he'd aged a decade in the hours since Vivian had been taken. His suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, and there was a cut above his left eyebrow that suggested he'd been in the thick of the fighting. But his eyes burned with an intensity that stole Vivian's breath. She barely made it out of the SUV before he was there, pulling her against his chest with a desperation that spoke louder than words. His arms wrapped around her like steel bands, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other pressed against her lower back, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He murmured against her hair that he's got her, that she's safe. Vivian's carefully maintained composure shattered. She buried her face against his chest and sobbed, weeks of fear and confusion, and impossible choices pouring out in great heaving gasps. Adrian held her through all of it, murmuring words of comfort and protection, his own body shaking with emotions he couldn't quite contain. When the storm finally passed, Vivian pulled back enough to look at his face. She told him about Elena. Adrian's expression went cold and deadly. He knew. His men were hunting her now. She wouldn't get far. Vivian told him she'd sold her to Constantin and wanted control of the empire. Adrian said she wanted a lot of things she'll never have now. His thumb brushed away a tear from Vivian's cheek. He said he should have seen it coming, should have protected her better. This was his fault. Vivian said simply that he found her. That's what mattered. Adrian's voice dropped to something raw and vulnerable. He'd torn apart half the East Coast looking for her. When he realized she was gone, that she'd taken her, he stopped, seeming to struggle for words. He'd faced down enemies, survived assassination attempts, built an empire from blood and violence. But the thought of losing her terrified him more than anything he'd ever experienced. Vivian whispered, needing to hear him say it. Why? Adrian cupped her face in both hands, his gray eyes holding hers with burning intensity. He said it was because somewhere between kidnapping her and fighting to get her back, he fell in love with her. And that changed everything. The confession hung in the air between them, impossibly fragile and devastating in its honesty. Vivian's breath caught, her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough to hurt. She managed to say that it was insane. They barely knew each other. Adrian agreed this whole situation was completely insane, but it was also true. He loved her. He loved the fire in her when she fought back. He loved the way she saw through all his carefully constructed walls. He loved her strength and her stubbornness, and the way she refused to let world breaker her. And he would burn down empires to keep her safe. Vivian's hands fisted in his shirt, anchoring herself against the emotional vertigo threatening to sweep her away. She said she didn't even know if she could trust these feelings. Everything had been so twisted and complicated. Adrian said he knew, and he wasn't asking her to love him back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he needed her to know that she wasn't a prisoner anymore. She wasn't an incubator for his heirs or a pawn in family power plays. She was the woman he loved, and that meant she got to choose what happened next. She could stay or go. It was her decision. He'd give her money, protection, a new identity if she wanted it. She could disappear and raise those babies somewhere he'd never find her. Or, his voice roughened, she could stay here and let him try to build something real with her. A partnership, a family, a life that was actually worth living. The offers stole Vivian's breath. After weeks of having every choice stripped away, Adrian was handing her back her freedom. It would be so easy to run, to take the money and protection and vanish into a safer life far from the violence of his world. But when she looked at Adrian's face, scarred and dangerous and achingly vulnerable, Vivian realized she didn't want to run. Not anymore. She admitted she was terrified. Of him, of this world, of everything that could go wrong. He said that made two of them. She added she was still angry about the kidnapping, and he couldn't just erase that with a love confession. He wouldn't dream of trying. Vivian took a shaky breath, but she thought she was falling for him too, and that scared her more than anything Constantine could have done. Adrian's expression transformed, hope and wonder breaking through the careful control he wore like armor. Vivian pulled him down and kissed him, pouring everything she couldn't say into the press of her lips against his. Adrian responded with devastating tenderness, kissing her like she was precious and irreplaceable, like she was the answer to every question his broken life had ever asked. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. He said they were going to have to deal with the fallout from all this. Elena's betrayal, Constantine's attack, the power vacuum it created. Things were going to get worse before they get better. She knew. He added that his enemies would come at her harder now that they knew what she meant to him. Vivian said then they'd face them together. Her hand moved to her stomach, protective and fierce. These babies deserved parents who fight for them, who fight for each other. Adrian promised they'd have that, whatever it took. He helped her into the mansion, past security teams and medical staff who'd been waiting to examine her. The doctor confirmed what Constantine's nervous physician had already established. The babies were fine, their heartbeats strong and steady, despite everything their mother had endured. Vivian submitted to the examination with patience she didn't feel, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Adrian never left her side through any of it, his hand a constant anchor she clung to as the adrenaline faded and left her feeling hollowed out and fragile. They were finally alone in her room when Adrian's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression went cold. Vivian asked what it was. He said his men found Elena. His voice was flat, emotionless. She was trying to board a plane to Monaco using a fake passport. Vivian's stomach twisted. She asked what he was going to do. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, staring at his phone screen with an expression Vivian couldn't read. Then he looked up, and the pain in his eyes made her heart ache. He said quietly that she was his sister, the only family he had before her and these babies. But she sold her to his worst enemy, put her and his children in mortal danger for money and power. There were consequences for that kind of betrayal. Adrian interrupted, seeming to read Vivian's thoughts. He said he wouldn't kill her. That's not who he wanted to be anymore, but he couldn't let her go unpunished either. She made her choice. Now she would live with the fallout. He made several calls in rapid succession, his voice crisp and commanding, issuing orders that would strip Elena of everything. Her money, her connections, her plate in the Blackwood Empire. When he finally hung up, he looked exhausted. He told Vivian she'd be alive, but she'll have nothing. No power, no resources, no way back into this world. For someone like Elena, that was worse than death. Vivian reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. She said she was sorry it came to this. Adrian's grip tightened. He wasn't. She showed him who she really was. It was better to know now than to keep trusting someone who would destroy everything he cared about for her own ambition. He climbed into bed beside Vivian without asking, pulling her against his chest with careful tenderness. She went willingly, too tired to maintain any pretense of distance, needing his warmth and solidity to chase away the lingering shadows of the warehouse. Adrian murmured against her hair for her to sleep. He'd keep watch. Nothing was going to hurt her while he was breathing. Vivian believed him. Against all logic and reason, she trusted this dangerous man to keep her safe. Her eyes drifted closed as Adrian's steady heartbeat lulled her toward unconsciousness. She was almost asleep when his phone rang again. Adrian answered it with a curse, his body going rigid against hers. His voice was sharp, dangerous, as he asked when, and then how many of them. Vivian forced her eyes open, dread pooling in her stomach at Adrian's expression. He ordered the perimeter secured and wanted triple guards on every entrance. Nobody would get in or out without his personal authorization. He hung up and met Vivian's frightened gaze. He told her they had another problem. When she asked what kind, he said grimly that his mother had just arrived at the front gate, and she wasn't alone. The word sent ice through Vivian's veins. She'd heard Adrian mention his mother exactly once. The woman who'd abandoned him when he was 8 years old, leaving him to be raised by a father who treated him like a weapon. The woman whose absence had shaped Adrian into the man he'd become. Vivian whispered, asking why she was here. Adrian's expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. He said it was because news of his heirs had spread further than he anticipated, and because his mother had always had impeccable timing when it came to exploiting weakness. He stood, already pulling his phone out to make more calls, his voice shifting back into the cold command of the crime lord, who'd built an empire on ruthlessness and control. Vivian watched him pace the room, issuing orders and demanding updates, and understood with crushing clarity that the danger was far from over. Elena's betrayal had been a symptom of something larger, a crack in the foundation of Adrian's empire that his enemies were already moving to exploit. And now his mother, a woman who'd proven decades ago that family meant nothing to her, had appeared at exactly the wrong moment. Vivian's hand moved to her stomach, protective instinct overwhelming everything else. 3 tiny lives depended on her survival, on her ability to navigate the deadly waters of Adrian's world. She couldn't afford to be just a victim anymore. Couldn't afford to wait for others to protect her. If she was going to survive this, if her babies were going to survive this, she needed to become something more than the struggling waitress who'd stumbled into a crime lord's bed. She needed to become someone who could stand beside Adrian Blackwood as an equal, someone who could fight for her children with the same ruthless determination he brought to protecting his empire. The thought terrified her, but it also crystallized something inside her chest, hardening her resolve into something sharp and unbreakable. Adrian ended his call and turned back to her, reading something in her expression that made him pause. He asked quietly what she was thinking. Vivian met his eyes, letting him see the steel beneath her fear. She was thinking that she was done being the damsel who needed rescuing. If they were going to do this, build a life together, raise these children, survive whatever was coming, then she needed him to teach her how his world worked. The real rules, the actual dangers, everything. Adrian studied her for a long moment, something like pride flickering across his features. He said that wasn't a decision she should make when she was exhausted and traumatized. Vivian stood, closing the distance between them. She had never been more certain of anything in her life. His mother was downstairs, his empire was under attack, and she was carrying 3 babies who were targets before they were even born. She could either hide in this room and hope he protected her from everything, or she could learn to protect herself. She asked which he thought had a better chance of keeping her alive. Adrian's lips quirked in something that might have been a smile if the situation weren't so dire. He said she was remarkable. She corrected him, saying she was terrified and desperate, and absolutely done with being helpless. That wasn't remarkable, it was survival. Adrian said they'd start her education tomorrow. Right now, he needed to deal with his mother, and she needed rest. She insisted on coming with him. If his mother was here because of the babies, then she needed to see that Vivian wasn't some fragile flower who would wilt under pressure. They needed to present a united front, or they would show weakness. She reminded him that he taught her that in his world, perception is everything. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. He agreed, but she had to stay close to him. If anything felt wrong, she was to leave immediately. He asked if she understood. She did. They descended the grand staircase together, Adrian's hand a steady presence at the small of Vivian's back. Security personnel lined the hallways, more than Vivian had ever seen before, all armed and alert. The mansion felt like a fortress preparing for a siege. The woman waiting in the main sitting room stole Vivian's breath with her severe beauty. She had Adrian's sharp cheekbones and commanding presence, though age had softened her features into something almost regal. She wore designer clothes that screamed old money and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. But her eyes were cold calculation wrapped in maternal warmth, and they fixed on Vivian with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The woman's voice was honey over razor blades, as she called him Adrian, darling. She commented on what a formidable man he'd grown into and that his father would be proud. Adrian said flatly that his father was dead and she'd lost the right to call him darling when she walked out 30 years ago. He asked why she was here, calling her Catherine. Catherine's smile never wavered. She questioned if that was any way to greet her mother, especially when she'd come all this way to meet the woman carrying her grandchildren. Her gaze slid to Vivian, assessing and dismissive in equal measure. Vivian felt pinned under that scrutiny, reduced to component parts and found wanting. Catherine continued, her voice rich with false delight, about what a blessing 3 babies were and what a tremendous responsibility for someone so. She paused delicately, unprepared. Adrian said that Vivian was perfectly capable, his voice carrying a warning edge. Catherine agreed, but said that raising the heirs to the Blackwood Empire required more than capability. It required breeding, connections, and an understanding of how their world operated. Her smile sharpened as she added that these were things that couldn't be taught overnight to someone from such humble origins. Vivian felt Adrian tense beside her, preparing to defend her, but she spoke first. She calmly met Catherine's cold gaze without flinching and agreed that she was right. She didn't have breeding or connections. She was a waitress drowning in debt before his son decided she was important enough to protect. But she had something Catherine clearly didn't. She would never abandon her children for power or money or whatever, made her walk away from an 8-year-old boy who needed his mother. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Catherine's expression flickered. Surprise, then anger, then grudging respect. She called her spirited. She could see why Adrian was drawn to her, but spirit wouldn't protect her from what's coming. She asked if he was going to pretend the Vulov family wouldn't retaliate for Konstantine's losses, or that the other families wouldn't see his divided attention as weakness. She told him his enemies were circling, darling, and Vivian was the bleeding wound, drawing them closer. Adrian said with terrifying calm that he'd kill every single one of them. Anyone who threatened Vivian or his children would die. That wasn't a threat, he told his mother. It was a promise written in blood. Catherine laughed, the sound utterly devoid of warmth. She called him dramatic, saying he always was the theatrical one. But they both knew he couldn't protect her forever, not when he was spread so thin trying to hold an empire together. So she was there to offer a solution. He didn't want her solutions. She insisted he'd want this one. Catherine leaned forward, her expression shifting into something almost genuine. She offered to take the children when they were born. She'd raise them properly, give them the education and connections they needed to truly lead this empire. He could visit whenever he liked, maintain his relationship with them, and Miss Carter could return to whatever life she chose, compensated handsomely for her service as a surrogate. The audacity of the proposal stole Vivian's breath. Adrian's hand tightened on her back, the only sign of his fury. He quietly told her to get out. Catherine told him to be reasonable. Adrian's voice was soft and absolutely lethal as he told her to get out of his house before he had his men throw her out. And if she ever suggested taking his children from their mother again, he would end her, blood relation or not. Catherine stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt. She said he was making a mistake. When this all fell apart, and it would, she told him not to come crying to her for help. She swept toward the door, then paused to look back at Vivian. She told her to enjoy her fairy tale while it lasted, but to remember that in their world, happy endings are just intermissions before the real tragedy begins. Then she was gone, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and veiled threats. Adrian's entire body was vibrating with suppressed rage. Vivian reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. She said quietly that she was okay, that his mother couldn't hurt her with words. Adrian pulled Vivian against him, his embrace almost crushing. He said she'd try with more than words. His mother didn't make social calls. She was planning something. And whatever it was going to be worse than Elena's betrayal. Vivian held him tighter, feeling the tremors running through his powerful frame. She said they'd face it together, just like everything else. But even as she said the words, fear curled cold in her stomach because Catherine Blackwood hadn't looked like a woman making idle threats. She'd looked like a woman who already had a plan in motion, who'd come to the mansion not to negotiate, but to observe her pieces on a chessboard only she could see. and Vivian had the terrible feeling that they were all already 3 moves behind. The weeks following Catherine's visit transformed the mansion into something between a fortress and a war room. Adrian doubled security, installed new surveillance systems, and began teaching Vivian the brutal realities of his world with a thoroughness that left her exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. She learned to read the subtle signals his men used to communicate threats, learned which families could be trusted, and which were waiting for any sign of weakness to strike. She learned that power in Adrian's world wasn't about violence. It was about knowing exactly when to deploy violence and when to choose mercy for maximum strategic advantage. One evening, Adrian spread surveillance photos across his desk while Vivian studied them from her position curled in the leather armchair nearby. Her pregnancy was starting to show now, a gentle swell beneath the designer clothes. Adrian insisted on buying her. He said the Castellanos were reaching out, wanting to negotiate a truce. Vivian's education had progressed enough that she understood the implications. After they backed Constantine's play against him, that was bold. Adrian's finger tapped one of the photos, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit. He said that was survival. Marco Castellano was smart enough to know Constantine's arrest left a power vacuum. He was offering an alliance before someone more aggressive filled that space. Vivian asked if he trusted him. Adrian glanced up, then corrected himself. He didn't trust anyone except her. The simple admission still had the power to steal Vivian's breath, even after weeks of growing closer. They'd fallen into a routine that felt almost domestic, despite the constant undercurrent of danger. Breakfast together, when Adrian's schedule allowed, evenings spent in his office, while he worked and she read, nights tangled together in bed, where he touched her with a reverence that made her feel precious and protected. But the shadow of Catherine's visit hung over everything, like a storm that refused to break. Vivian voiced the concern that had been gnawing at her, saying his mother had been quiet, too quiet. Adrian's expression darkened. He knew. His people were tracking her movements, but she was being careful. No obvious meetings with his enemies, no financial transactions that raised flags. She was planning something, but he couldn't figure out what. Vivian suggested maybe she gave up. Adrian said Catherine didn't give up. She waited. He stood and crossed to where Vivian sat, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. His hands settled protectively over her rounded stomach, feeling for the movement that had become more frequent as the babies grew. He said she'd never wanted anything to do with him until now. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Vivian leaned into his warmth, letting herself draw strength from his solid presence. She said they'd figure it out. Whatever his mother was planning, they'd handle it. Adrian's lips brushed her temple, soft and achingly tender. He asked when she became the optimistic one. Vivian tilted her head back to meet his eyes. It was when she realized being terrified all the time was exhausting, and when she started trusting that he actually knew what he was doing. He called that a dangerous assumption. Maybe. But he hadn't let her down yet. Adrian kissed her then, deep and searching, pouring emotion into the contact that he still struggled to voice. Vivian responded with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, anchoring herself against the dizzying feeling that swept through her every time he touched her, like this. Like she was the most important thing in his carefully controlled universe. They were still wrapped around each other when Adrian's phone buzzed. He pulled back with a curse, glancing at the screen, then his entire body went rigid. Vivian asked what was wrong, alarm spiking through her. He said there was a security breach at the east gate, 3 vehicles approaching fast. Adrian was already moving, grabbing the gun he kept in his desk drawer and checking the magazine with practiced efficiency. He told her to get to the safe room now. His voice cracked like a whip, leaving no room for argument. This wasn't a discussion. But before Vivian could move, the French doors leading to the garden exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Men in tactical gear poured through the opening, weapons raised, moving with military precision that suggested extensive training. Adrian fired twice, dropping the first man through the door, then threw himself in front of Vivian as return fire tore chunks from the desk and walls. He dragged her down behind the heavy oak desk, his body covering hers, protecting her and the babies with his own flesh. He growled for her to stay down, then raised his head and fired again. Another attacker fell, but more were coming, too many to fight off alone. Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs, terror threatening to overwhelm her. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A fierce protectiveness for the lives growing inside her, and the man shielding her body with his own. She couldn't just lie here helpless while Adrian fought for their survival. Her hand closed around the letter opener on Adrian's desk, heavy brass, sharp enough to damage if she could get close enough. It wasn't much, but it was something. She pulled it free and gripped tight, waiting for an opening. Adrian's security team burst into the room from the hallway, engaging the attackers in a firefight that turned the elegant office into a war zone. Adrian seized the opportunity to pull Vivian to her feet and half-drag her toward the door, using his body as a shield between her and the bullets still flying. They made it into the hallway when a figure stepped out from a side corridor, blocking their escape. The man was older, scarred, with the cold eyes of someone who'd killed enough times that it no longer registered as significant. His weapon was already trained on Adrian's chest. Over the sounds of combat, the man calmly said Mr. Blackwood that Mrs. Vulov sent her regards. Vivian's blood turned to ice. Mrs. Vulov, Konstantin's mother, the matriarch of the family that Adrian had destroyed when he rescued Vivian from the warehouse. This wasn't a random attack. This was revenge. Adrian's grip on Vivian tightened, his mind clearly calculating angles and odds. He said that Irina Volkov was 80 years old and supposedly retired, and he was surprised. She still had the reach to coordinate something like this. The man said simply that he killed her son and asked if he thought there would be no consequences. Adrian corrected him, saying Konstantin died resisting arrest by federal agents and that he had nothing to do with it. The man countered that he put him in a position to be arrested and destroyed his operation. The blood was on his hands regardless of who pulled the trigger. The man's weapon never wavered, he said. Mrs. Vulov wanted him to understand loss the way she understood it. She wanted him to watch everything he loved burn before she granted him the mercy of death. Adrian's laugh was cold and utterly without humor. He said then she was going to be disappointed because he wasn't dying today and neither was anyone he loved. He moved faster than Vivian could track, yanking her sideways and firing simultaneously. The attacker's shot went wide, punching into the wall where Vivian's head had been a second earlier. Adrian's aim was perfect. The man dropped with a hole in his forehead, dead before he hit the ground. But the motion had exposed Adrian's side, and another attacker Vivian hadn't seen was already firing from the far end of the hallway. Adrian jerked as the bullet caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He stayed on his feet through sheer force of will, still keeping himself between Vivian and danger. Vivian screamed his name. He insisted he was fine and told her to move. He pushed her through the nearest door into what turned out to be a linen closet, following and slamming the door behind them. His left arm hung useless, blood soaking through his shirt in an expanding stain that made Vivian's stomach drop. She told him he wasn't fine, that he was bleeding. He dismissed it as a flesh wound that missed the bone. Adrian was already pulling out his phone with his good hand, texting rapid commands. He said the extraction team was 2 minutes out, and they just needed to stay alive that long. The door shuddered as someone hit it from outside. Once, twice, then the distinctive sound of a battering ram. The lock wouldn't hold much longer. Adrian raised his weapon, his hand steady, despite the blood loss. He told her when that door opened, she was to run for the window at the end of the hall. Don't look back. Don't stop. His people would find her. She said she wasn't leaving him. She gripped the letter opener tighter, positioning herself beside him instead of behind him. They would survive this together or not at all. Adrian looked at her, something raw and fierce blazing in his eyes. He said she was the most stubborn woman he'd ever met. She replied that he loved her for it. He said he did, more than she knew. He kissed her hard and fast. The door exploded inward. Adrian fired immediately, dropping the first attacker through the opening. Vivian struck out with the letter opener as another man lunged for her, catching him in the neck in a spray of hot blood that made her stomach heave. The man fell, clutching his throat, and Vivian stumbled backward in shock at what she'd just done. Adrian was still firing, but his movements were getting slower, his left side drenched in blood now. They were going to be overrun. Too many attackers, not enough ammunition, and nowhere left to run. Then the cavalry arrived. Adrian's security team hit the attackers from behind in a coordinated assault that turned the tide instantly. The remaining men in tactical gear tried to retreat, but were cut down with ruthless efficiency. Within 30 seconds, the hallway was silent, except for the ringing in Vivian's ears and her own ragged breathing. Marcus, Adrian's head of security, appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with professional calm despite the carnage. He said, "Sir, they needed to get him to medical, that he was losing too much blood." Adrian, already swaying on his feet, said Vivian first, and to make sure she was. He didn't finish the sentence before his legs gave out. Vivian caught him as he collapsed, or tried to. His weight pulled them both down to the floor. She cradled his head in her lap, pressing her hands against the bullet wound to slow the bleeding while terror clawed at her throat. She begged Adrian to stay with her. His eyes were already glassy with shock, but he managed to focus on her face. She told him the babies were fine, and she was fine, but he needed to stay conscious. She yelled at him not to dare leave her now. Adrian's hand found hers, gripping with surprising strength. He mumbled that he loved her and should have said it more. Vivian said fiercely, tears streaming down her face, that he'd have years to say it. He wasn't dying in a hallway. She wouldn't let him. Marcus was already coordinating with the medical team. Adrian kept on permanent standby. They appeared with a stretcher and emergency equipment, working with practiced efficiency to stabilize him enough for transport. Vivian refused to let go of Adrian's hand through all of it, staying close even when they loaded him into an ambulance for the drive to the private medical facility Adrian used for situations like this. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of sterile waiting rooms and hushed medical consultations. The bullet had torn through muscle and nicked an artery, requiring emergency surgery to repair the damage. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but the blood loss had been severe. The next 24 hours would be critical. Vivian sat in a chair by Adrian's bedside in the ICU, still wearing clothes stained with his blood, and watched the monitors track his vital signs with mechanical precision. Her hands rested on her stomach, feeling the babies moving inside her, active and healthy, blissfully unaware of how close they had come to losing their father before they were even born. She whispered to Adrian's unconscious form that he couldn't leave them, that they needed him. She needed him. She begged him to fight and come back. Marcus appeared in the doorway looking exhausted. He told Miss Carter she should rest and offered to get her cleaned up and get some food. She insisted she wasn't leaving him. Marcus said Adrian would want her to take care of herself for the babies. Vivian's voice was steady, despite the tears still sliding down her cheeks. She said Adrian would want her exactly where she was. She asked what happened to the attackers. Marcus replied that the ones who survived were being questioned. They'd confirmed Irina Vulov ordered the hit. She was currently in Moscow, protected by the Russian government. They couldn't touch her there, but she could keep sending people after them. Marcus's silence was answer enough. Vivian stared at Adrian's pale face, at the tubes and wires connecting him to machines that were keeping him alive, and felt something hard and cold crystallize in her chest. Irina Vulov wanted revenge for her son. Fine. But if she thought Adrian was the only one capable of ruthless retaliation, she was about to learn a very painful lesson. Vivian said quietly that she wanted everything they had on her. Financial records, known associates, properties she controlled, everything. Marcus studied her with new assessment. Vivian interrupted, her voice harder than she'd ever heard it. She was carrying the next generation of the Blackwood family, and that made her a target. Whether she hid in this hospital room or took action, she'd rather be the one choosing how this played out. So, either he helped her or stayed out of her way. A slow smile spread across Marcus's scarred face. He said that Adrian had mentioned she was tougher than she looked. He was beginning to see what he meant. Over the next 3 days, while Adrian drifted in and out of consciousness, Vivian educated herself on Irina Vulov with single-minded intensity. The woman was old-world Russian mafia, brutal and traditional with connections that spanned continents. She'd built her power by being more vicious than the men around her, carving out territory with calculated violence that left her enemies too terrified to retaliate. But everyone had weaknesses, and Vivian found Irina's buried in financial records that suggested the matriarch had been quietly funneling money out of her organization for years. Not for retirement, but to fund a legitimate business empire under her daughter's name. A daughter who wanted nothing to do with the family's criminal activities and was trying to build a clean life in London. It was the kind of information that could destroy Irina's reputation with the traditionalists who followed her, who would see protecting a daughter's innocence as weakness rather than maternal love. It was also the kind of leverage that could end a war before more people died. Vivian was still studying the documents when Adrian finally woke, his eyes focusing on her with gratifying clarity. He rasped that she looked terrible, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. Vivian's laugh was half sob. She pressed her lips to his forehead, his cheeks, his mouth, careful not to jostle any of the medical equipment, but needing to touch him to confirm he was real and alive and back with her. She said that he got shot protecting her, and he didn't get to criticize her appearance. Adrian's good hand found hers, squeezing weakly. He agreed it was fair enough and asked about the babies. She said they were perfect, moving around like tiny acrobats. They were going to be a handful. He said of course they were. They were his. Adrian's eyes tracked to the document spread across the table beside his bed. He asked what she was working on. Vivian hesitated, then decided he deserved the truth. She was ending the war with Irina Vulov before she sent more people to kill them. Adrian's expression sharpened despite his weakened state. He said that wasn't her responsibility. She interrupted, saying it absolutely was her responsibility. Those attackers came for all of them. He almost died. Their children were targets before they were even born. So either they waited for Irina to strike again, or they took the fight to her first. She chose the latter. She explained what she'd found, watching Adrian's face shift from concern to reluctant approval as he absorbed the implications. He asked if she wanted to threaten her daughter when she finished, forcing Irina to back down or watch her carefully constructed legitimate empire crumble. Vivian corrected him, saying she wanted to give her a choice. She could accept that Constantine died because he made stupid decisions, or she could watch everything she's built for her daughter burn, while they systematically dismantled her organization from the inside out. Either way, the attacks stopped. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made Vivian's pulse quicken. He said that when he first took her from that clinic, she was terrified and angry and completely lost. Now she was plotting a strategy that would make most of his advisors nervous. He asked what happened to her. Vivian said simply that she fell in love with a crime lord, and she decided that if she was going to survive in his world, she needed to stop thinking like a victim and start thinking like a partner. Adrian pulled her down for a kiss that was gentle, but no less devastating for its tenderness. He said he didn't deserve her. She replied probably not, but he was stuck with her anyway. They implemented the plan 2 days later, when Adrian was strong enough to participate via video conference from his hospital bed. Vivian delivered the message to Irina Vulov herself, speaking calmly and clearly while Adrian's people transmitted evidence of her daughter's business dealings and exactly how exposed they would be if certain information reached the right ears. Irina's face on the screen was stone, but Vivian saw the flash of fear in her eyes when she understood what was at stake. Irina said, her accent thick with contempt, that she would destroy an innocent woman to save her own skin. Vivian corrected her, saying she would protect her family by any means necessary, just like she tried to protect hers by sending assassins after them. The difference was she was giving her a choice to end this peacefully. She hadn't extended them the same courtesy. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Finally, Irina spoke. The debt was paid. Her son was avenged by the blood already spilled. There would be no further action against the Blackwood family. Irina's smile was cold and sharp as a knife. She said if Vivian was lying, then she would prove herself more ruthless than she gave her credit for, and her daughter would suffer for her mistakes. She stated that she was many things, but not a fool. They had an understanding. The screen went dark. Vivian released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her whole body trembling with reaction now that the confrontation was over. Adrian reached for her hand, pride, and something deeper shining in his eyes. He said just negotiated a truce with one of the most dangerous women in the Russian mafia while pregnant with triplets, and she did it without flinching. Vivian admitted she was flinching on the inside. He said he could have fooled him. Adrian pulled her closer, careful of his shoulder. He said she was going to be an incredible mother and an absolutely terrifying partner in this empire. She asked if that was a promotion. He replied that it was a recognition of what she already was. Adrian's expression grew serious. He said when those babies were born, he wanted her by his side in every decision, not as his kept woman or the mother of his heirs, but as his equal, someone who understood the stakes and had the spine to make hard choices. The offer stole Vivian's breath. In Adrian's world, power wasn't given lightly. By offering to share authority over his empire, he was giving her something more valuable than love. He was giving her respect. Vivian said to ask her again when he wasn't on pain medication, but her voice was thick with emotion. He said he'd ask her every day until she said yes. Adrian was released from the hospital a week later, his shoulder healing well, but still requiring physical therapy. They returned to the mansion to find it transformed into something even more secure than before. New surveillance systems, expanded security teams, and reinforced safe rooms that could withstand anything short of a military assault. But the greatest change was invisible. The way Adrian's people now looked at Vivian with respect rather than pity. The way other families approached her at the negotiating table as a power in her own right. The way she'd stopped being just the woman carrying Adrian Blackwood's children and become someone to be reckoned with. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the following weeks. Vivian's body adapted to carrying 3 lives with surprising resilience. Adrian was constantly attentive, cutting back on business travel to stay close, attending every doctor's appointment, and reading books on fatherhood with an intensity he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. They were having dinner one evening when Vivian felt the first contraction, a tightening across her abdomen that made her drop her fork. Adrian was on his feet instantly. He asked what was wrong. She said she thought another contraction hit, stronger this time. She thought it was time. The next 12 hours were a blur of pain and fear and overwhelming medical intervention. Carrying triplets meant complications and required a team of specialists and monitoring equipment that turned the private birthing suite into something resembling mission control. Adrian never left her side, holding her hand through contractions, murmuring encouragement when she wanted to give up, being her anchor in a storm of overwhelming sensation. He said for the 100th time that she could do this, his voice steady even though his eyes showed his terror. He called her the strongest person he knew and told her it would just be a little longer. Vivian gasped as another contraction peaked. She said she couldn't, that it was too much. He insisted she could. He told her to look at him. She forced her eyes to his face, finding strength in the absolute conviction she saw there. He said fiercely that she negotiated with Russian mafia bosses. She survived kidnapping and assassination attempts. She turned herself into a force to be reckoned with in one of the most dangerous worlds imaginable. She could absolutely do this. The delivery doctor appeared between her legs, his voice calm and professional. He told Vivian he needed her to push now, a big push. It was time to meet her first baby. Vivian bore down with everything she had. Adrian's hand gripped hers so tight it should have hurt, but instead felt like the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. The pressure was enormous, impossible. Surely her body couldn't. And then a cry split the air, tiny and furious and absolutely perfect. The doctor announced it was a boy, placing the squirming infant on Vivian's chest for a brief moment before whisking him away to be checked and cleaned. Vivian barely had time to process the overwhelming rush of love before another contraction hit. She asked if it was already time again. The doctor said with a slight smile that babies don't wait for anyone. He asked if she was ready for number 2. The second baby, another boy, arrived 10 minutes later with the same furious cry as his brother. And 15 minutes after that, their sister made her entrance into the world, smaller than her brother's, but with lungs that suggested she'd have no trouble making herself heard. When it was finally over, when all 3 babies had been checked and declared healthy and were wrapped in blankets, being held by nurses, Vivian lay back against the pillows, feeling utterly destroyed and completely triumphant. Adrian kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He said she was incredible, and they were incredible. He didn't have words for what he was feeling right now. Vivian, exhausted but needing to hear it, told him to try anyway. He said he was grateful, terrified, overwhelmed, and more in love with her than he knew it was possible to be. Adrian's voice cracked slightly. He said she gave him a family, something worth protecting that wasn't built on violence and fear. She gave him hope. The nurses brought the babies over, helping Vivian position them for their first feeding. 2 boys and a girl, each one perfect and impossible. Adrian sat beside her on the bed, one arm carefully around her shoulders, his free hand gently touching each tiny head with a reverence that made Vivian's heart ache. She asked softly what they should name them. They had discussed names before, but never quite decided. Now looking at 3 actual faces instead of abstract possibilities, Vivian found herself at a loss. Adrian was quiet for a moment, studying each baby in turn. He finally said James, indicating the firstborn. It was after his grandfather, the only family member who ever showed him kindness before he died. His finger moved to the second boy, and Lucas, because it meant light, something he didn't have much of before her. He looked at their daughter, the smallest of the 3, but somehow already the most determined looking. He said the choice was hers. He'd pick the boys. She could pick their daughter. But Vivian studied the tiny face, seeing traces of herself mixed with Adrian's features in a combination that stole her breath. She decided on Grace, because despite everything they went through, somehow they found grace in the chaos. Adrian repeated the name, testing it. He said it was perfect. They were all perfect. But even as they sat there in their bubble of new parent joy, Vivian caught the tension in Adrian's shoulders, saw how his eyes kept tracking to the door, as if expecting threats. She said quietly that his mother was still out there, knowing he'd understand. She'd never come back after that first visit. Adrian's expression hardened slightly. He knew. Marcus had people watching her, but she'd been quiet. Too quiet, like she was waiting for something. Vivian asked what for. He wished he knew. The answer came 3 days later, when they were preparing to take the babies home from the hospital. Vivian was in the bathroom getting dressed when she heard raised voices from the main room. She emerged to find Adrian in a tense standoff with someone. Vivian couldn't see past his protective stance. Then Catherine's voice cut through, sweet and poisonous. She said surely he'd let a grandmother meet her grandchildren, that she'd come all this way. Adrian's hand was inside his jacket where Vivian knew he kept a weapon. He told her she had 30 seconds to leave before he had security remove her. Catherine told him not to be dramatic, that she just wanted to see the babies. She insisted they were her blood as much as his. Adrian's voice was ice. He says she gave up any claim to family 30 years ago. Those children had a grandmother who cared about them. Vivian's mother might be dead, but her memory mattered more than Catherine's living presence ever will. Catherine's laugh was brittle. How noble. But she wasn't there to argue parental rights. She was there to make him an offer. He wasn't interested. She insisted he would be. Catherine finally came into view, moving around Adrian to look at where Vivian stood holding Grace while James and Lucas slept in their bassinets. Her expression softened into something might have been genuine emotion. She said they were beautiful and that Vivian did well. Vivian said quietly for her to get away from them, her arms tightening around her daughter. Catherine said she wasn't a threat to them. In fact, she was there to ensure their safety. She explained that word had spread that Adrian Blackwood had softened, that he was distracted by domesticity, vulnerable in ways he never was before. His enemies were gathering, and when they struck, those babies would be their primary targets. Adrian said through gritted teeth that he could protect his own family. Catherine questioned if he could, because she counted at least 5 major families positioning themselves to move against him in the next 6 months. The Castellanos were demanding concessions he couldn't afford to give. The New York syndicates were pushing into his territory, and the federal investigation into his shipping operations was getting closer every day. She told him he was spread too thin and needed help. He said he didn't need anything from her. Catherine said pride was expensive. Her eyes met Vivian's, and there was something almost like sympathy there. She told Adrian she made mistakes with him. She was young and stupid, and she chose power over family. But she was offering him a chance to not repeat those mistakes. She wanted to help secure his empire so he could focus on being a father to those children. Real help, not schemes or power plays. She wanted to be part of this family again. The offer hung in the air, heavy with possibility and danger. Vivian studied Catherine's face, searching for deception, but all she saw was a woman who looked tired and alone and maybe, possibly, genuinely regretful. Adrian said flatly, no. But Vivian heard the hesitation beneath the word. She said quietly that maybe they should hear her out. His head whipped toward her, betrayal flashing across his features. He couldn't believe she was serious. Vivian said steadily that she was serious about protecting their children by any means necessary. If she was right about enemies gathering, they needed to know. And if she was offering genuine help, they'd be stupid to refuse it just because of old wounds. She interrupted, saying that she abandoned him, and that was unforgivable. But their children deserved every possible advantage, every layer of protection. His pride wasn't worth their safety. The words hit Adrian like physical blows. He stared at Vivian for a long moment, something crumbling in his expression before turning back to Catherine. He harshly gave her one chance. If she proved herself useful, she'd get supervised access to the children. If she betrayed them in any way, schemed against them, or tried to manipulate the situation, he would end her himself, family or not. He asked if she understood. Catherine's smile was tremulous but genuine. She understood and thanked him, promising he wouldn't regret this. He muttered that he already did, but he stepped aside to let her approach the babies. Vivian watched Catherine's fist transform as she looked down at the sleeping boys and the alert girl in Vivian's arms. The hardness melted away, leaving behind something vulnerable and achingly human. She whispered to Adrian that they had his eyes, all three of them. Adrian said they had Vivian's stubbornness, but his voice had softened slightly. That was the trait that mattered. Over the following weeks, Catherine proved herself surprisingly useful. She had connections Adrian had lost when she left, old loyalties she'd maintained, and information about rival families that proved invaluable in fortifying Adrian's position. Slowly, carefully, she integrated herself into the family structure. Not as a mother to Adrian, that bridge had burned too thoroughly, but as an ally, a resource, and eventually a grandmother who seemed genuinely devoted to the triplets. But Vivian never fully trusted her. She watched Catherine with the same careful assessment she'd learned to apply to everyone in Adrian's world, waiting for the inevitable betrayal. It came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the babies were 2 months old. Vivian had just put Grace down for a nap when she heard voices from Adrian's office that made her pause outside the door. It was Catherine's voice, low and urgent, speaking to someone on a phone call. She said the transfer needed to happen within the week. She understood, but if they didn't move now, Adrian would figure out what they were planning. Vivian's blood turned to ice. She pressed herself against the wall, every instinct screaming that she was about to hear something that would shatter the fragile peace they'd built. Catherine continued, saying he trusted her now, or at least he'd stopped watching her so closely. Vivian vouching for her was the key. Once she had her support, everything else fell into place. Vivian's hands clenched into fists. She'd been played. The whole apologetic grandmother routine had been an act, and she'd fallen for it completely. Catherine continued that the children were the leverage they needed. With them under their control, Adrian would have no choice but to. She insisted she wasn't backing out now, that they'd come too far. She just needed to make sure the team was ready to move when she gave the signal. The call ended. Vivian heard Catherine's footsteps approaching the door and barely had time to step back into a side hallway before she emerged. Catherine passed without noticing her, heading toward the nursery where the babies slept. Vivian's mind raced. She could confront Catherine now, but without proof, it would be her word against a woman who'd spent weeks building credibility. She needed evidence. Needed to know exactly what Catherine was planning before she could stop it. She pulled out her phone and texted Marcus with shaking hands. Catherine was planning something. She told him to activate full surveillance on her now. His response was immediate. They were already on it. Adrian suspected, and they'd been monitoring. Relief flooded through Vivian, followed immediately by anger. She asked if they let her bring Catherine into this family, knowing she was a threat. He replied they needed to know what she was planning and couldn't do that if they shut her down too early. He told her to stand by, and Adrian would brief her shortly. Vivian wanted to scream. Instead, she forced herself to breathe, to think clearly, to remember that she'd become someone who could handle this kind of betrayal without falling apart. She found Adrian in his office 10 minutes later, Marcus beside him reviewing surveillance footage on multiple screens. Vivian demanded to know how long he'd known. Adrian turned, and the guilt in his expression was answer enough. He said since the second week. She'd reached out to 3 different rival families. offering to deliver the children in exchange for territory and power. He'd been feeding her false information and watching her make her moves. And he hadn't told her. Vivian's voice rose despite her efforts at control. She accused him of protecting her by lying, by letting her think they were building something real with her when it was all just another manipulation. Adrian said quietly that he needed her to act natural around her. If she'd known the truth, she would have sensed the change. They needed her to believe she'd fooled them completely. The logic made sense, but it didn't make the betrayal hurt less. Vivian had been used as a pawn in Adrian's counter-scheme, kept in the dark like a child rather than the partner he'd claimed to respect. Her voice cold, she asked when he was planning to tell her. He replied, when they had her completely cornered. Adrian's expression pleaded for understanding. He knew she was angry, but this was necessary. Vivian interrupted, telling him not to dare tell her what was necessary. She'd negotiated with Irina Vulov while he was unconscious in a hospital bed. She'd earned the right to be part of these decisions, not kept ignorant for the sake of his strategy. Silence fell, heavy between them. Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably and excused himself, leaving them alone with the weight of broken trust. Adrian crossed the room to where Vivian stood, but stopped just short of touching her. He said she was right, that he should have trusted her with the truth. He was protecting himself, not her. Old habits. Vivian said sharply for him to break them, because if they were going to do this, raise these children and run this empire together, she needed to know he saw her as an equal, not just someone to be managed and protected. Adrian said urgently that he did see her as an equal. Sometimes he saw her as more than that, stronger than him, braver than him, better than he'll ever be, and that terrified him. So he fell back on old patterns, where he controlled everything and trusted no one. He was sorry. The apology cracked something in Vivian's chest, anger draining away to leave exhaustion behind. She sagged against the desk, suddenly aware of how tired she was. Not just from this confrontation, but from months of living in constant crisis mode. She asked quietly what the plan was, what would happen now to Catherine. Adrian said they would let her make her move. The team she was coordinating with planned to strike tomorrow night during the charity gala they were hosting. They'd try to take the children while security was focused on the event. They'd be ready for them. And Catherine? Adrian's expression went cold and hard. She chose her path. Now she would live with the consequences. Tomorrow night arrived with deceptive normalcy. The gala proceeded as planned. 200 guests mingled in the mansion's grand ballroom while a full orchestra played and champagne flowed. Vivian wore a designer gown that hid the exhaustion of new motherhood, playing the role of gracious hostess, while her mind tracked every exit, every guest who strayed too close to the private wing where the babies slept under heavy guard. Catherine was there too, elegant in vintage couture, smiling and charming, the other guests like she belonged in this world. Vivian watched her and felt nothing but cold calculation. The attack came at 11, precisely when Marcus had predicted. Armed men breached the east wing, moving toward the nursery with professional efficiency. But Adrian's people were waiting, turning the hallway into a kill zone that ended the threat in under 3 minutes. In the chaos, Vivian saw Catherine moving toward a side exit, clearly planning to escape in the confusion. She wasn't getting away. Vivian intercepted her, blocking the door with her body. She asked if she was going somewhere. Catherine's mask slipped, showing calculation beneath the maternal warmth. She told Vivian to get out of her way, that this didn't concern her. Vivian countered that it absolutely concerned her. Those were her children she just tried to steal. Catherine claimed she was offering them a better life. Vivian corrected her flatly, saying she was selling them for territory. Adrian had everything recorded, every phone call, every meeting, every betrayal. It was over. Catherine's expression hardened into something ugly. She asked if Vivian thought she'd won. She called her nothing, a waitress playing dress-up in a world she'd never truly understand. She said Adrian would tire of her eventually. Vivian interrupted, saying when he did, she'd still be the mother of his children. She'd still be the woman who built something real with him. And Catherine would still be the woman who abandoned her son and tried to steal her grandchildren for profit. They were not the same. Security appeared before Catherine could respond, escorting her away without ceremony. She didn't fight, didn't protest, just looked back at Vivian with something like respect in her cold eyes. Adrian found Vivian a moment later, pulling her into his arms with desperate relief. He asked if she was all right. She was fine, and the babies were safe. All three had slept through the whole thing. Adrian pulled back to study her face. He noted that she confronted Catherine. Vivian said she tried to run, so she stopped her. Adrian kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. He said she was extraordinary, and she knew that. Vivian said she was learning. She asked what would happen to her now. Adrian said she was in federal custody. It turned out she was wanted for fraud in 3 countries. He'd made a deal with the prosecutor. Full cooperation in exchange for ensuring she spent the next 20 years in a very secure prison. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, Vivian just felt tired. Tired of the constant danger, the endless scheming, the parade of people who wanted to hurt them, or use them or destroy what they were trying to build. She said quietly that she wanted out. Adrian went very still. He asked what she meant by out. Vivian looked up at him, needing him to understand. Not out of them, never out of them, but out of this life. The violence, the crime, the constant threat. She wanted their children to grow up without armed guards and safe rooms. She wanted them to have normal childhoods. She asked if that was possible. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. He said he'd been thinking the same thing, seeing them every day, watching her with them, realizing what they could be if they weren't constantly fighting for survival. It had made him question everything he'd built. Vivian said they could walk away, hope beginning to bloom in her chest. They could sell the empire, take the money, and start over somewhere safe. He replied that it wasn't that simple. Men like him didn't get clean exits. Vivian gripped his lapels, fierce and certain. She told him to make it simple. He was Adrian Blackwood. He'd done impossible things before. She asked him to do one more impossible thing. Choose them over the empire. Choose family over power. Adrian's eyes searched hers, and she saw the war happening inside him. Decades of building his empire, fighting for every inch of territory, making himself into someone too dangerous to destroy. Could he really walk away from all of that? He said slowly that if he did this, if he tried to extract them from this life, it would take time. Months, maybe years, and it would be dangerous. Every family they'd ever competed with would see it as weakness and try to strike while they were vulnerable. Vivian said then they'd be careful, they'd be smart, and they'd survive. She pressed her hand to his chest, feeling his heart beating hard beneath her palm. They'd survived everything else. They could survive this, too. Adrian covered her hand with his, holding it against his heart like a promise. He agreed. They'd do it together. The kiss that followed sealed more than their agreement. It sealed a future they were choosing to build. One decision at a time, one day at a time, fighting their way towards something better than the violent legacy they'd both inherited. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But as they stood together in the aftermath of Catherine's final betrayal, Vivian understood with perfect clarity that she'd found something more valuable than safety or comfort, or anything else she'd once thought she needed. She'd found a partner worth fighting for, children worth protecting, and a love strong enough to survive anything their dangerous world could throw at them. That would have to be enough. The dismantling of Adrian Blackwood's criminal empire took 18 months of careful maneuvering, dangerous negotiations, and more close calls than Vivian wanted to count. But every step forward felt like reclaiming pieces of their souls from the darkness that had defined Adrian's life for so long. The first major move came 6 weeks after Catherine's arrest. Adrian called a meeting of the 5 families who controlled the eastern seaboard's underworld, gathering them in a neutral location with enough security to prevent bloodshed, but not so much that anyone felt threatened. Vivian insisted on attending despite the risk, understanding that presenting a united front was essential to making this work. She sat beside Adrian at the head of the table, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms while the boys remained at home under Marcus's watchful protection. The message was clear. This wasn't just business. This was about family, about legacy, about choosing a different path. Adrian began, his voice carrying the command that had built his empire, but now served a different purpose. He was there to propose something unprecedented, a complete and peaceful transition of power. The room erupted in overlapping voices, confusion and suspicion written on every face. Marco Castellano, the silver-haired head of the New York syndicate, raised his hand for silence. He asked if he was retiring. His tone suggested he found this both impossible and insulting. Adrian Blackwood didn't retire. Men like them died in office or in the street, but they didn't walk away. Adrian said calmly that he'd be the first. He had children now, a family he actually cared about protecting, the life they led, the constant violence, the federal investigations, the risk of prison or death at every turn. That wasn't what he wanted for them. So, he was offering each of them pieces of his territory in exchange for guarantees of safe passage out of this world. Dmitry Sulov, a younger boss with more ambition than sense, asked why they would negotiate when they could just take what they wanted once he was gone. Adrian's smile was sharp and cold. He said because he wasn't gone yet, and if they forced him to fight his way out instead of walking away peacefully, he would burn everything to the ground on his way to the exit. Every operation, every connection, every carefully constructed alliance, he'd destroy it all, rather than let it fall into hostile hands. They could have an empire worth billions if they worked with him, or ashes worth nothing if they tried to take it by force. He told them to choose wisely. The threat hung in the air, backed by decades of reputation that proved Adrian Blackwood always kept his promises, especially the violent ones. Marco leaned back in his chair, studying Adrian and Vivian with calculating eyes. He asked what guarantees they had that this wasn't some elaborate trap, that he wouldn't consolidate power while they divided his territory among themselves. Adrian said they had his word, and he gestured to Vivian. They had her. His wife, the mother of his children, the only person in this world he valued more than power. She'd oversee the transition personally, act as a neutral arbiter in any disputes. He said they knew her reputation by now. She ended the war with Irina Volkov. She exposed Catherine's betrayal before it could succeed. She had no interest in empire building. She just wanted to take their family somewhere safe and never look back. Every eye in the room turned to Vivian. She met their stares without flinching, Grace stirring slightly in her arms before settling back to sleep. Vivian said quietly that it was true. She had no stake in their territorial disputes or power plays. She just wanted her children to grow up without armed guards and assassination attempts. If helping facilitate this transition got them that outcome, she'd do whatever it took to make sure it was fair and final. The negotiations lasted 6 hours, breaking twice when tempers flared too hot and threatened to turn into violence. But eventually, slowly, an agreement took shape. Adrian's shipping operations would go to the Castellanos, the protection rackets to Sulov's organization. The money laundering networks distributed among smaller families who'd proven themselves trustworthy over the years. In exchange, Adrian received immunity from retaliation, guaranteed safe passage for his family, and enough legitimate business interests to ensure they'd never want for money. The federal investigations would be gently redirected toward families who hadn't agreed to the peace terms, incentivizing cooperation while eliminating threats. It wasn't perfect. Several families refused to participate, choosing instead to position themselves to strike once Adrian was truly vulnerable. But the majority signed on, seeing the opportunity for expansion without the cost of all-out war. The hardest part wasn't the negotiations. It was watching Adrian systematically dismantle it built over 30 years, piece by piece, like destroying his own monument. Vivian saw the toll it took in the lines that appeared around his eyes, the way he'd stand at his office window late at night, staring out at the grounds he'd soon leave forever. She found him there one evening, 3 months into the transition. The babies were finally asleep after a particularly fussy night. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. She asked quietly if he was having second thoughts. Adrian admitted he had them every day. He'd built this empire from nothing, survived things that should have killed him, made himself into someone too powerful to destroy, and now he was voluntarily giving it all away for something better. He hoped. Adrian turned in her arms, his expression vulnerable in the dim light. He wondered what if he didn't know how to be anything, except what he'd always been. What if he couldn't adjust to a normal life? Vivian said then they'd figure it out together, the same way they figured out everything else. One day at a time, one decision at a time. Adrian kissed her then, soft and searching, needing the reassurance that only she could provide. He said he loved her and needed her to know that even when he was difficult or distant or struggling with all of this. Vivian murmured against his lips that she knew, And she loved him, too, even when he was being impossible. Especially then. They made love that night with desperate tenderness, clinging to each other in the darkness, reaffirming their choice with every touch and whispered word. Afterward, lying tangled together in their bed, Vivian traced the scar on Adrian's shoulder where the bullet had torn through during Arena's attack. She asked if he regretted any of it, everything that happened to bring them here. Adrian was quiet for a moment, his fingers drawing patterns on her bare skin. He said he regretted that she got hurt, that she was terrified and kidnapped and threatened. He regretted that their children would grow up with stories about their father's criminal past instead of something cleaner, but he didn't regret meeting.
But he didn't regret meeting her, falling in love with her, building a family with her.
His arms tightened around her. Never. She was the best thing that ever happened to him, even if the road to finding her was paved with violence. She corrected him, saying soon to be Vivian Blackwood. They'd scheduled the wedding for 6 months out, wanting to wait until the transition was complete and they were truly free to start their new life. Adrian agreed, a smile in his voice. He asked if she really wanted his name after everything associated with it. She said she wanted his name because it came with him attached. The empire she could do without, the man she was keeping forever. The crisis that threatened to derail everything came on a cold morning in early March when the babies were 10 months old. Vivian was feeding Grace breakfast while the boys destroyed their high chairs with enthusiastic messiness when Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. He said without preamble that they had a problem. The Moretti family was backing out of the agreement. They'd allied with 3 smaller operations, and they were positioning to take not just Adrian's remaining territory, but everything the other families had negotiated for as well. Vivian's blood ran cold. The Morettis were old school, brutal, and commanded enough firepower to start a war that would consume everyone involved. If they were making a move now, it meant they'd been planning this betrayal from the beginning. She asked where Adrian was. He was meeting with the accountants about transferring the last of the offshore holdings. He didn't know yet. The words came out before Vivian could second-guess them. She told Marcus not to tell him and that she would handle this. Marcus raised an eyebrow. With respect, he said, the Morettis didn't negotiate with women. Vivian finished his sentence, saying that was good. It meant they'd underestimate her. She told him to set up a meeting, just her and Vincent Moretti, on neutral ground, today, if possible. Marcus said Adrian would lose his mind if he found out. Vivian interrupted. Adrian had spent months tearing apart his life to give them peace. The least she could do was handle one more negotiation before they walked away. She ordered Marcus to set it up. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. He said she'd come a long way from the scared woman in the clinic. Vivian said she'd had good teachers. Now he needed to move. They didn't have much time. The meeting happened 6 hours later in a private room at an upscale restaurant the Morettis controlled. Vivian arrived with only 2 bodyguards, a show of confidence that bordered on recklessness. Vincent Moretti was already waiting. A man in his 60s, with cold eyes and hands that had personally killed more people than Vivian wanted to imagine. He greeted her with false warmth, surprised that Adrian had sent his woman to negotiate his surrender. Vivian said he didn't send her, taking the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. He didn't know she was there. This meeting was off the books. Vincent's expression sharpened with interest. He found her keeping secrets from her husband deliciously scandalous. Vivian ignored his attempt to rattle her. She was there to make him an offer, one that would benefit him far more than breaking the peace agreement and starting a war he might not survive. He called them bold words from someone with no army. She said she didn't need an army. She had information. Vivian pulled a manila envelope from her bag and slid it across the table, telling him to open it. Vincent did. His expression shifted from amusement to shock to barely contained fury as he reviewed the contents. Financial records showing his son's embezzlement, photographs of meetings with federal agents, evidence of betrayals that would destroy Vincent's credibility with his own organization. His voice dangerously quiet, he asked where she got this. Vivian explained that Adrian had spent 30 years building the most extensive intelligence network on the East Coast. When he decided to retire, that network didn't disappear, it just got repurposed. They'd been monitoring every family involved in the transition, including his, as insurance in case anyone got greedy. He called it blackmail. Vivian corrected him, calling it business. He could honor the agreement, and she'd destroy these files and never mention what they contained. Or he could break the agreement, and she'd send copies to everyone who mattered in his organization and watch it tear itself apart from the inside. The choice was his. Vincent stared at her with open hatred. He said she had no idea what she was playing with. The Morettas had been in this business for 4 generations. Vivian countered that Adrian Blackwood dominated this business for 30 years with nothing but intelligence and ruthlessness. She'd learned from the best. She leaned forward. She told him what was going to happen. He was going to happen. He was going to honor the peace agreement. He was going to call off whatever alliance he'd been building, and he was going to spread the word that anyone who came after the Blackwood family once they'd retired would answer, not just to Adrian, but to every family who wanted this transition to succeed peacefully. Because, make no mistake, if he started this war, everyone would lose. The federal heat would be unbearable, territories would be contested for years, and the profit margins everyone had been enjoying would evaporate overnight. She asked if his pride was really worth that much destruction. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and barely contained violence. Finally, Vincent shoved the envelope back across the table. He said, with something almost like respect in his voice, that she was more like him than anyone realized. He agreed. The agreement stood. But if she ever threatened him or his family again... Vivian interrupted. She wouldn't need to worry about that. In 6 months, they'd be gone, and he'd never hear from them again. That was the whole point of this exercise. She stood to leave, then paused. She added one more thing. Her children's safety was the only thing she cared about more than her own life. If anything happened to them, if someone took a shot, planted a bomb, or even made a credible threat, she would hunt down everyone responsible in their entire bloodline. Adrian taught her that mercy was a weakness in this world. She chose to be weak only as long as he chose to be smart. She told him to remember that. Vivian walked out without waiting for a response, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She made it to the car before her hand started shaking, the reaction setting in now that the adrenaline was fading. Marcus, who'd been waiting by the vehicle, took one look at her face and handed her a bottle of water. He asked if she was okay. She said she just threatened a man who's killed people for looking at him wrong. No, she was not okay. Vivian drank deeply, trying to calm her racing pulse. But the meeting went well. Marcus said Adrian was going to kill him for letting her do this. Vivian took another drink, then met Marcus's eyes. Adrian was going to thank him for preventing a war. She asked if he really thought she couldn't handle it. Marcus said with a slight smile that he knew exactly how she'd handle it. That's why he set up the meeting. When Adrian found out what she'd done, and he found out within 3 hours, because apparently Marcus's loyalty only went so far, the explosion was spectacular. He stormed into their bedroom where Vivian was changing Grace's diaper, his face flushed with fury and fear in equal measure. He asked if she was insane for meeting with Vincent Moretti alone. She said she had bodyguards. Adrian's hands clenched into fists. He argued that 2 bodyguards against the Moretti family was nothing. He could have killed her, taken her hostage, used her against him to extract concessions. Vivian interrupted calmly, finishing with Grace and lifting her daughter onto her hip. She said, but he didn't, because she gave him a better option than violence, the same way he'd been doing for 30 years. He said that was different. He could protect himself. Vivian's voice sharpened. She asked if after everything they'd been through, after every crisis she'd navigated, he still saw her as someone who needed protecting rather than someone who could stand beside him as an equal. Adrian opened his mouth, then closed it, seeming to actually hear what she was saying. His shoulders slumped slightly. He said quietly that she was right, and he was sorry. She'd proven herself 100 times over. It was just that when Marcus told him where she'd gone, all he could think about was losing her again. The fear made him stupid. Vivian crossed to him, Grace babbling happily between them. She knew, but he had to trust that she could take care of herself, that she could take care of them. They were partners, remember? That went both ways. Adrian pulled them both into his arms, careful of Grace's squirming form. He agreed, partners, even when it terrified him, especially when it terrified him. The final months of the transition proceeded smoothly after that. the Moretti situation serving as a warning to other Hollies who might have been considering similar betrayals. Adrian liquidated his remaining criminal assets, converting everything into legitimate investments and offshore accounts that would fund their new life. The mansion went on the market, selling within a week to a tech billionaire who had no idea about its violent history. They chose a small coastal town in Northern California for their fresh start. Far from the East Coast power structures and familiar faces, the house they bought was nothing like the mansion. Just a comfortable 4-bedroom with a yard big enough for the children to play, and views of the ocean that made Vivian's heart ache with unexpected peace. The wedding happened on a cliff, overlooking the Pacific, 2 weeks before they left the East Coast forever. Just immediate family, which meant the babies, Marcus, who'd agreed to relocate with them as head of personal security, and a handful of people who'd proven themselves loyal through everything. No crime bosses, no power plays, no hidden agendas. Just 2 people who'd survived impossible odds, choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage. Vivian wore a simple white dress that moved in the ocean breeze, her hair loose around her shoulders. Adrian stood at the makeshift altar in a dark suit, his eyes bright with emotion as she walked toward him, carrying Grace while Marcus shepherded the boys. The officiant was a retired judge who owed Adrian a favor, but asked no questions about their past. The ceremony was brief and perfect, vows exchanged with shaking voices and trembling hands. Promises made that meant everything, because they'd already been tested in fire and blood. When it was her turn, Vivian said, tears streaming down her face, that she promised to choose him every day, in peace and in chaos, in joy and in fear. He gave her a family when she thought she'd lost everything. He showed her she was stronger than she ever imagined, and he loved her fiercely, even when she gave him every reason not to. She would spend the rest of her life making sure he never regretted taking that first chance on a nobody waitress at a wedding reception. Adrian's voice was rough with emotion when he responded. He promised to be the man she deserved, not the man he was forced to become. To put family before power, love before legacy. She saw humanity in him when everyone else just saw a monster. She gave him hope for a future he never thought possible. And she stood beside him as an equal, even when he forgot to treat her like one. He would spend the rest of his life proving that choosing her was the best decision he ever made. The kiss when they were pronounced married was gentle and devastating, weighted with everything they'd survived, and everything they were choosing to become. Grace clapped her tiny hands between them, delighted by the attention, while the boys made grabby motions toward the cake that had been set up nearby. The reception was small and perfect, held in the backyard of their soon-to-be former mansion with string lights and music that had nothing to do with power or danger. Vivian danced with Adrian as the sun set, her head on his shoulder, feeling more at peace than she'd ever felt in her life. She asked softly if he had any regrets. Adrian murmured against her hair that his only regret was that it took so long to figure out what actually mattered. But they were here now, and that's what counted. The move to California happened 3 days later. They drove across the country in a convoy of SUVs, loaded with belongings and children, taking the long route to avoid major cities, stopping at roadside diners and cheap motels like a normal family on a normal road trip. The babies loved it, fascinated by the changing landscapes outside the windows, while Vivian and Adrian slowly learned to breathe without constantly watching for threats. Their new home felt surreal at first. Quiet mornings without armed security patrols, afternoons spent at parks without scanning for assassins, evenings cooking dinner together, while the babies played on the kitchen floor. Adrian struggled the most with the adjustment, used to constant crisis and strategic planning, finding himself adrift without an empire to command. But slowly, carefully, he learned to be just a father and husband instead of a feared crime lord. He took James and Lucas to their first swimming lessons, patient and encouraging even when they cried and clung to him in fear of the water. He walked Grace around the neighborhood in her stroller, pointing out birds and flowers with the same intensity he'd once devoted to territorial disputes. He made Vivian breakfast in bed on lazy Sunday mornings, learning to express love through small gestures instead of grand protective ones. Vivian watched him transform and fell in love with him all over again. This version of Adrian who smiled more easily, who didn't flinch at unexpected sounds, who could hold his children without constantly calculating threat assessments. She transformed too, finding purpose in ways she'd never expected. She started a foundation that helped women escape dangerous situations, domestic violence, human trafficking, and crushing debt, giving them the resources and support to rebuild their lives. It was funded by Adrian's legitimate businesses, but run entirely by Vivian, pouring her experience of surviving impossible odds into helping others do the same. The first woman she helped was a single mother with 2 kids, drowning in medical debt and working 3 jobs to stay afloat. Vivian saw herself in that exhausted face, not remembered the desperation that had driven her to a clinic to end a pregnancy she couldn't afford. She gave the woman enough money to pay off the debt, connected her with job training programs, and set up a trust fund for the children's education. The woman asked, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the check that represented more money than she'd see in 5 years of work, why she was doing this. Vivian said simply, it was because someone gave her a chance when she needed it most, and because no one should have to choose between survival and dignity. The foundation grew quickly, expanding to help hundreds of women over the following years. It gave Vivian's life meaning beyond just being Adrian's wife or the children's mother, though those roles remained the most important parts of her identity. The children thrived in their new environment. James grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and asked questions about everything. Lucas was pure energy, always moving, always exploring, needing constant supervision to keep him from climbing trees he couldn't safely get down from. And Grace was the perfect combination of both parents, with Vivian's stubbornness and Adrian's strategic mind, already manipulating her brothers into doing what she wanted at age 2. They attended a normal preschool and played with neighborhood kids who had no idea their father had once been one of the most feared criminals on the East Coast. They were just the Blackwood kids, rambunctious and sweet and loved beyond measure. Life wasn't perfect. Adrian still had nightmares sometimes about the violence of his past, waking in cold sweats with Vivian's name on his lips. Vivian occasionally found herself scanning crowds for threats that no longer existed, habits from their dangerous months that proved hard to break, and they both knew that complete safety was an illusion. People from Adrian's former life still existed, still remembered, and still might someday decide that old grudges mattered more than peace agreements. But they were happy. Genuinely, impossibly happy in ways Nayard imagines impossible when their relationship began with kidnapping and coercion. The threat they'd always feared came on Grace's 3rd birthday. They were having a party in their backyard, nothing elaborate, just neighborhood families, and the simple joy of children playing games and eating too much cake. Vivian was helping Grace blow out candles when Marcus appeared at her elbow, his expression grim. He said they had a situation. Someone had been watching the house. Professional surveillance, multiple angles. They knew they were there. Vivian's blood turned to ice, even as she kept smiling for the children's benefit. She asked how long. At least 3 days. They only caught them this morning when they got sloppy. Adrian knew and was handling it. He wanted her to keep the party going like nothing was wrong, so they wouldn't spook whoever was watching. Vivian nodded, her mind already racing through possibilities. This was what they'd prepared for, what part of her had always known was coming. You didn't walk away from Adrian's world without eventually having to answer for it. She made it through the rest of the party on autopilot, smiling and chatting with other parents while her mind calculated exit strategies and threat assessments. When the last guest finally left, she found Adrian in his office, surrounded by surveillance photos and grim-faced security personnel. He said without preamble that it was the Kozlov family, small-time operators out of Boston. They were claiming he killed their father during a territory dispute 15 years ago, and they were here for revenge. She asked if they were right, if he did kill their father. Adrian's expression was haunted. He said probably that he killed a lot of people back then. He thought they'd covered all the loose ends, potty off everyone who mattered. But he guessed some grudges ran deeper than money. She asked what they wanted, what everyone wants. Blood for blood. They were going to try to take the children, use them as leverage to force him into a confrontation. The words hit Vivian like a physical blow. No, absolutely not. They would end this now. He was working on it. Vivian's voice was still. She told Adrian he didn't understand. They didn't sacrifice everything, rebuild their entire lives just to have some bottom feeder family threaten their children because of decisions he made 15 years ago. They would end this permanently, tonight. Adrian studied her face, reading the determination there. He asked what she was proposing. A final negotiation. One last time they would remind the criminal underworld why nobody with any sense messes with the Blackwood family. And then they'd make it crystal clear that this life was over. Anyone who came after them, their children, or the peace they'd built, would get destroyed so completely that it served as a warning for generations. He asked if she wanted to negotiate from a position of strength they no longer had. Vivian pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts. They still had allies. Marco Castellano owed them for the favorable territory split. Dmitry Sokov's empire would have collapsed without the connections they left him. Even Vincent Moretti respected the peace they built. One call to each of them, explaining that the Kozlov family was threatening to destabilize everything by breaking the retirement agreement, would bring more firepower backing them than the Kozlovs could ever survive. Adrian's expression shifted from concern to something like pride. She was proposing they use the same power structure he spent months dismantling to defend the peace it created. Exactly. The Kozlovs were small time. They only moved because they thought they were weak and alone. They would remind them, and everyone else, watching that they were neither. And then they'd make the cost of breaking the peace so catastrophic that no one would ever try it again. Adrian pulled her into his arms, kissing her hard and fierce. He said she was absolutely terrifying. She teased that she learned from the best. The calls went out that night. By morning, representatives from 5 major crime families had arrived in their quiet California town, an unprecedented show of force that made the local police nervous, but didn't result in any actual violence. The message was clear. The Blackwood family was protected not by Adrian's past reputation, but by the current power structure's investment in maintaining the peace they'd negotiated. The meeting with the Kozlovs happened in a warehouse Marcus had secured, neutral ground surrounded by enough firepower to start a small war. Vivian insisted on attending, despite Adrian's objections, understanding that her presence sent its own message. The Kozlov brothers were younger than Vivian expected, in their mid-30s with hard eyes and the desperate edge of men who'd built courage on rage rather than strategy. The eldest, Alexei, did the talking. He said they'd been looking for Adrian Blackwood. Adrian said calmly, "You found me. Now what?" Now he would pay for what he did to their father. Blood for blood, like the old ways. Vivian said before Adrian could respond that the old ways were dead. They were living in a new world now, one where grudges from 15 years ago didn't justify threatening innocent children. Alexei's gaze flickered to her with contempt. He said this didn't concern her. She replied that she was his wife, the mother of those children he was planning to kidnap. It absolutely concerned her. Vivian stepped forward, putting herself between Adrian and the Kozlov brothers. She told them what was going to happen. They were going to walk away from this vendetta. They were going to return to Boston and build their organization without ever mentioning the Blackwood name again. And in exchange, they wouldn't activate the kill orders they'd already distributed to every family represented in this room. Alexei's laugh was nervous. He said she was bluffing. Vivian gestured to the family representatives standing around the warehouse perimeter. She asked Marco what his instructions were if the Kozlovs refused to see reason. Marco Castellano stepped forward, his expression grave. He was to eliminate the entire Kozlov organization within 72 hours, leaving no one alive who might continue the vendetta. Vivian continued, asking Dmitry. Sulov confirmed the same orders. The peace agreement included provisions for dealing with families who threatened it. The Kozlovs activated those provisions when they came after the Blackwoods. Alexei's face had gone pale, finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd stumbled into. He said they just wanted justice. Adrian interrupted, saying they wanted revenge. There was a difference. Justice would be accepting that their father made choices that got him killed in a world where violence is currency. Revenge was threatening his children because they were too small to hurt him directly. They chose revenge. Now they had to deal with the consequences. Vivian added, unless they chose differently, right here, right now. They could walk away, build their business, and live their lives. They'd never think about them again. But if they persisted, if they made one more move toward them or their family, every person in this room would make it their mission to erase the Kozlov name from existence. No second chances, no negotiations, just complete and total destruction. The silence that followed was absolute. Vivin watched the calculation happen in Alexei's eyes, pride warring with survival instinct, rage struggling against the cold reality of being outmatched and outmaneuvered. Finally, he nodded. They would leave. Adrian said with finality that he wouldn't come back to that life. That part of his life was over. This meeting was the last time he'd activate those old connections. After this, they were just a normal family living a quiet life. He gave his word. Adrian said coldly that if his word meant nothing, then they'd have plenty of company in whatever revenge fantasy they were nurturing, because half the families here would love an excuse to eliminate competitors. He was the only thing stopping them from using their threat as justification. He told them to walk away while they still could. The Kozlovs left without further argument, disappearing back to Boston, and according to Marcus's later reports, never speaking the Blackwood name again. The message had been received loud and clear. The retired crime lord and his family were off limits, protected by the very power structure they'd helped establish. But Vivin knew this couldn't happen again. They'd been lucky this time, but luck eventually ran out. She told Adrian that night, after the children were asleep, that they needed insurance, something that guaranteed no one ever tried this again. He asked what she had in mind. Vivian pulled out a laptop, opening files she'd been compiling for months. For every family they negotiated with during the transition, she kept records. Not blackmail material, like with the Moretis, just detailed documentation of the agreements, the territories transferred, the promises made, a complete accounting of how the current power structure came to exist. And she was going to publish it. Not everywhere, just in places where it mattered. Encrypted files sent to federal investigators with instructions to open them only if something happened to their family. The same files sent to rival organizations who'd love to know exactly how their competitors gained power. Everyone stayed peaceful because everyone had something to lose if the peace broke. Adrian stared at her. Something like awe in his expression. It was mutually assured destruction, but with information instead of violence. She was creating a deterrent that didn't require them to maintain any power at all. If they died or disappeared, everyone's secrets would get exposed, and the whole carefully constructed power balance would collapse. Exactly. They'd protect them, because protecting them protected themselves. And they'd get to actually live their lives without constantly waiting for the next threat. Adrian pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. He said it was brilliant, terrifying, and absolutely perfect. He asked when she became smarter than him. Vivian teased that she was always smarter than him. He just had better weapons. The insurance policy went into effect within a week, carefully crafted and distributed to ensure maximum impact. The response from the criminal underworld was exactly what Vivin had predicted, quiet acceptance mixed with grudging respect. The Blackwood family became truly untouchable, not through violence, but through strategic positioning that made them more valuable alive and peaceful than dead or disrupted. And finally, wonderfully, they were free. The years that followed were the happiest of Vivin's life. She watched her children grow into remarkable people. James with his quiet wisdom and love of learning. Lucas with his boundless energy and fearless spirit. Grace with her strategic mind and fierce loyalty to her brothers. They knew nothing of their father's past, beyond vague mentions of a business that Adrian had left behind before they were born. Adrian transformed completely into the man Vivin had always known existed beneath the crime lord exterior. He coached Lucas's soccer team with the same intensity he'd once brought to territory negotiations. He helped James with science projects that got more elaborate each year. He taught Grace to play chess, delighting in her natural talent for strategy while carefully steering her toward using those skills for good rather than manipulation. And he loved Vivin with a devotion that never wavered, never dulled, never took for granted the miracle of building something beautiful from such violent beginnings. On their 10th anniversary, Adrian took Vivian back to the cliff where they'd been married, leaving the children with Marcus for a rare night alone together. They stood watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, his arms wrapped around her from behind. Both of them older and happier, and so far removed from the people they'd been when they first met. Vivian asked quietly if he ever missed it. The power, the empire, the feeling of controlling everything around him. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. Sometimes he missed the certainty of it, knowing exactly who he was and what he was capable of. But then he'd go home to her and the children and realize he traded one kind of power for something infinitely more valuable. The power to shape young lives, to build a family, to love and be loved without agenda or manipulation. He wouldn't go back to that old life for anything in the world. She asked if that was true, even though it nearly killed them both multiple times. Adrian turned her in his arms, cupping her face in his hands. He said she was right that night in his office, when she said they could bend instead of breaking. They survived the worst this world could throw at them and came out stronger on the other side. That was a different kind of power. The power of resilience, of choosing love over legacy, of building something that actually matters. Vivian kissed him as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, sealing the promise they'd made to each other a decade earlier. They'd survived impossible odds, defeated enemies, overcame betrayals, and transformed themselves from broken people into partners who'd built a life worth living. Behind them, their children's laughter drifted up from the house, where Marcus was supervising an evening that probably involved too much ice cream and definitely too much chaos. It was the sound of normalcy, of safety, of the future they'd fought so hard to create. Vivian said, taking Adrian's hand, "Let's go home." And together they walked back, toward the light and warmth and beautiful chaos of the family they'd built from ashes and determination, and a love strong enough to survive anything. The empire was gone. The danger had passed. The violence was behind them. What remained was everything that actually mattered. 3 incredible children, a love that had been tested in fire and proven unbreakable, and a future bright with possibility instead of shadowed by threat. Vivian Carter, once a struggling waitress drowning in debt, now stood as Vivian Blackwood, wife, mother, philanthropist, and the woman who'd tamed the East Coast's most dangerous crime lord by showing him there was more to life than power and control. Adrian Blackwood, once feared by everyone who knew his name, now lived as a father who attended school plays and soccer games, a husband who still looked at his wife like she hung the stars, and a man who discovered that the greatest empire he could ever build was the family sleeping safely under his roof. They'd found grace in the chaos, just like their daughter's name promised.